Book 5, Prince Jadar, Chapter 27. Hawksworth heard the exultant cheer of the Rajputs riding behind him and snapped awake. It was mid-morning of the third day, and he had been dozing fitfully in the saddle since dawn, fatigue deep. In his bones. Through the trees ahead, the camp of Prince Jadar lay spread before them, blanketing half the valley. I told you we'd make the camp in 3 days' ride. Vasant Rao smiled wearily at Hawksworth and spurred his lathered mount Faw. Word, every man with us is eager to be with the prince. They had covered, it seemed to Hawksworth, well over 100 miles since departing the environs of Fatehpur. Between 500 and 600 Rajputs rode behind them, all heavily. Armed with an array of swords, pikes, clubs, saddle-axes. Each man's body armor, a woven network of steel and the quilted garment worn beneath it, was secured behind his saddle, ready to be donned for combat. Hanging at the side, each rider was a round leather shield and a large quiver containing his horn bow and arrows. None carried muskets. Hawksworth glanced back at Shirin, who rode a few paces behind, and they shared a tired smile. She had ridden the distance. Like a Rajput, but now her eyes were glazed with weariness. He had suddenly realized, the morning after they all galloped out of the camp at Fatehpur, that he had never before seen a woman in India ride. Where had she learned? He had pondered the question for an hour, riding behind her to watch her easy posture in the saddle, and then he had pulled alongside and asked her point-blank. She said nothing, merely smiled and tossed the loose strands of hair back from her face. He, understood her well enough to know this meant she had never ridden before and didn't wish Vasant Rao to know. This is the moment I've waited for so long. She reined her mount alongside Hawksworth's, reached out and touched his hand. You must help the prince now too? I'm not so sure I'm eager to die for Prince Jadar. You can always go back to Agra and wait to be murdered by Janahara's guards. The prince has saved your life and mine once already. What makes you think he'll bother with you again? To tell the truth, he also saved my life several months ago, the night we made landfall at Surat and were ambushed on the Tapti River by the Portugals. I know. She spurred her horse ahead. I receive the pigeon from Prince Jadar ordering it. I passed the message to the Shabandar, Mirza Nuruddin, who sent his personal Rajputs to protect you. Hawksworth urged his horse back alongside. So I was right. You were one of Jadar's agents in Surat. What did Nadir Sharif once call them? Swananiggers? I gathered information for the prince. She smiled in consent. I kept his accounts and coded his ciphers at the old observatory. Then you came along and started combing through it. You made my work that much more difficult. I never knew when you'd decide to go out there, or what you'd find. Why didn't you just tell me? What did I care? Too much was at risk. The prince once said nah. For to trust a Topiwala, Hawksworth laughed. But surely Mukarab Khan knew what you were doing. I think he probably guessed. But what could he do? He was only the governor, not Allah. He finally forbade me to go into the palace grounds alone. When I refused to obey, he thought of sending you to the observatory just to annoy me. She smoothed the mane of her horse. So I think he knew I was doing something there, but he was too entangled by his own intrigue. It's for Janahara to really care. Mukarab Khan worked for the queen. How? 2 ways. Naturally, he gathered intelligence for her, mainly about the Portuguese, but he also collected her Portuguese revenues at the ports of Surat and Cambay. Her revenues? I thought all duties went to the Moghul's imperial treasury. Shirin stifled a smile. That's what Arangbar thinks too, and at Surat it's mostly true. She collects very little. Mirza Nuruddin despises her and always finds devious ways to muddle her accounts, probably keeping some of her money for himself. But the Shabandar at the port of Cambay, where Mukarab Khan used to go every 2 weeks, would accept bribes from the Portuguese to undervalue their goods, and then split the money with Mukarab Khan and Janahara. She paused to watch a bright-winged bird dart past. Arangbar could never understand why his revenue from Cambay was so low. I heard. He's thinking about closing the port. She laughed. If only he knew it's going mostly to Janahara. Hawksworth rode silently for a moment, thinking. You know, Nadir Sharif once proposed the same arrangement for English goods if I would trade with him personally through the port of Cambay. I ignored him. I suspected he planned to find some way to confiscate the goods later on, claiming non-payment of duty. No, on that I think Nadir Sharif would have been airy fair. He always honors his agreements with friend or foe. She looked ahead, her weary eyes brightening as they approached the first jumble of tents and roaming livestock that formed the edge of the camp. Servants in soiled dhotis were leading camels bearing huge baskets of fodder along the makeshift streets between the tents. But their swindle will be finished when Prince Jadar becomes Moghul. He despises the Portuguese traders and their Christian priests. The perimeter of the compound reserved for Jadar and his zenana was clearly visible now, towering above the center of the camp. It was bordered by a 10-foot-high wall of billowing red chintz, decorated with a white hem at the top and held up with gilded poles spaced no more than 2 feet apart. Spreading out around it were clusters of smaller tents, red and white striped cloth for noblemen, and one-sided lean-to shelters ranging from brocade to ragged blankets for their troops. The prince asked that we all ride directly to the Gulul Bar, his personal compound. Vasant Rao shouted back over his shoulder at Hawksworth. I think he'll particularly want to see you, Captain. Cheers erupted as they entered the camp. Tents emptied and infantrymen lined the sides of the wide avenue leading to Jadar's compound, beating their swords against their leather shields. As Hawksworth studied the forest of flying standards spreading out on either side, he suddenly realized that each Mansabdar nobleman was flying his own insignia above his cluster of tents. Ahead, rising upward from the center of Jadar's compound, was a pole some 50 feet high with a huge vessel of burning oil secured. On its tip, Hawksworth examined the flame with astonishment, then drew his horse alongside Vasant Rao's. Why is there a light in the middle of the camp? It can be seen for miles. That's called the Akasdiya, Captain, the light of heaven. It's the Gr-8 camp light, and it's used by everyone to keep their bearings at night. How else could a man find his tent? There are probably 50,000 men here, with their women and servants. In the evenings, after all the cow dung fires are lighted for cooking, it's so smoky here you can't see your own tent till you're practically in it. This camp's a town almost the size of London. How do the people live? The camp bazaar travels with us, Captain, but you're right. It is a city, Mirl. E1 that moves. He gestured around them. The prince, of course, has his own personal supplies, but everyone else must shift for himself. See those small tents on the street over there, between those 2 high poles bearing standards. That is one of the bazaars for the Banyas, Hindu merchants who follow the army and sell grain, oil, ghee, rice, dal, everything you'd find in any town. They feed the men. The horses are fed by sending servants out to gather fodder. They cut grass and bring it back on camels or baggage ponies or even on their own head. On a long campaign, many of the men bring their women to cook and carry water. The women have to bring water from any wells or streams nearby. He laughed. Incidentally, I should warn you the prices these banyas ask are as inflated as the market will bear. For once I can't fault the merchants. They may well be out of buyers soon. Vasant Rao snorted and whipped his horse ahead. They were approaching the entry to Jadar's compound, a wide silk awning with the prince's banners flying from atop its posts. On either side stood rows of ornate red tents with yellow fringe along the eaves. As Hawksworth rode by, he noticed a high, open tent on the left holding caged hunting leopards. Next to it stood a massive canopy, surrounded by guards, sheltering light artillery. He squinted against the sun to look inside and caught a glimpse of several dozen small bore cannon mounted on carriages. He also noticed swivel guns fitted with a harness on their base, obviously intended to be mounted atop elephants or camels. In the center were several stacks of long-barreled Indian muskets wrapped in cloth. The last tent on the left, adjacent to the gate, sheltered several gilded palanquins and a row of immaculate bullock carts for Jadar's Zenana women. On the opposite side of the avenue was a row of stables for elephants, camels, and horses, turbe. And grooms were busy brushing the animals and fitting harness. Next to the stables were quarters for the animals' superintendents. Does all this belong to Jadar? These are for the prince, his women, and guards. Each nobleman also has his awe. And stables and light artillery. The top command is split 3 ways, with separate field commanders for the Rajputs, for the Muslims, for the men of Moghul descent. Vasant Rao smiled reflectively. It's always wisest not to mix, for one thing. Each needs its own bazaar. No Rajput would eat food handled by an untouchable Muslim. Their horses drew into the shade of the awning above the entrance to the Gulal bar. Vasant Rao and the other Rajputs reined in their mounts and began to dismount. This is the Nakarakhana, Captain Hawksworth, the entry to His Highness' private compound. Vasant Rao waved toward the red awning. Come, you'll be welcomed warmly by the prince, I promise you. I know he'd hoped you. Join him. Hawksworth swung down from his dark mare and stroked her one last time, wiping away the lather around the saddle. Then he turned to help Shirin alight. She leaned over and dropped into his arms, the sweat of exhaustion mingled with her perfume. Grooms from Jadar's stables were already waiting. As they took the horses, leader of the Rajput riders shouted staccato orders to them in Urdu, the lingua franca of the camp, then turned and dismissed his men, who immediately swaggered into the gathering crowd to embrace old acquaintances. His Highness is expecting you. Vasant Rao smiled and bowed lightly to the Rajput commander, who was tan and beardless save for a small mustache, with a white kirt, a small turban of braided gold cloth and a velvet-sheathed katar in a red waist sash. The Rajput nodded, then adjusted his turban and retrieved a tightly wrapped brocade bundle from behind his saddle. As he led the way through the Nakarakhana, Vasant Rao turned and motioned for Hawksworth and Shirin to follow. Jadar's guards directed them along a pathway of carpets leading through the outer barbican. Ahead was another gate, decorated with striped chintz and sealed with a hanging tapestry. As they approached it, the guards swept the tapestry aside and ushered them through. The second compound was floored entirely with carpets, and in its center stood an open, satin canopy held aloft by 4 gilded poles. The canopy shaded a rich Persian carpet and a throne fashioned from velvet bolsters. Several men with shoulder-high kettledrums and long brass trumpets were waiting nearby. As Hawksworth watched, 2 eunuchs emerged through a curtain at the far gate and lifted it high. While a fanfare of drums and trumpets filled the air, Prince Jadar strolled jauntily through the entryway, alone. He was dressed formally, with an elaborate silk cloak in pastel blue and a jeweled turban that reminded Hawksworth of the one worn by the Moghul himself. The brocade sash at his waist held a heavy katar with a ruby on each side of the handle. His beard was close-trimmed, accenting his dark eyes. Nothing about him suggested the appearance of a man facing impending defeat. Nimast, Madhu, my old friend. Jadar walked directly to the Rajput commander, grasped the man's turban and pressed it to his own breast. How long since we sat together and ate your Udaipur lapsi? From the same dish, the New Year's festival of Diwali 2 years past, Highness. In my brother's palace, and I wore the gold cloak you gave me in honor of the treaty between your armies and his 5 years before. And tonight we will dine together again, he smiled. If my cooks can find enough cane juice gur in all the bazaars to sweeten your lapsi. Seeing you again, Highness, sweetens my tongue already. He bowed and produced the brocade bundle. My brother, the Arana, sends this unworthy token together with his prayers for your victory. A eunuch stepped forward and brought it to Jadar. When the prince opened the wrapping, a scabbard holding a jewel-handled sword glistened in the mid-morning light. He does me honor. A Rajput blade knows its friends and its foes. Jadar smiled as he brushed the sword handle. Next he drew out the blade and tested its edge with his finger. The Rajput watched as Jadar sheathed the sword, then lifted the ruby-studded katar from his own belt. To honor him, I grant his brother my own katar. May its blade soon be crimson with the blood of his foes. The Rajput bowed as he received the knife. Jadar admired his new sword a moment longer, then continued. How many of our friends rode west with you? 1,000, Highness. More would have joined us now, but I thought it unwise. Your Highness will understand why. But those who did come I picked carefully. 20 officers of superior class, and the rest first and second class. The eunuchs watched your banners enter the camp. I've already heard some of the names. The prince's voice rose. I think you've gutted the Rajput field command in the imperial army. Not entirely, Highness. Ah, but I know you did. Jadar smiled and leaned forward, dropping his voice again and switching from Turkey to Rajasthani. The tent poles here can repeat my words. He drew himself erect again and signaled for a tray of pan leaves from the eunuchs. A tent has been prepared for you. Tonight we will dine again from the same dish, and you can tell me how many white-necked cranes you bagged on Pakola Lake last winter. The Rajput clasped his hands together and bowed lightly before taking a pan leaf. Tonight, Highness. As Madhu marched regally back through the entryway, Jadar turned and studied Shirin thoughtfully for a moment. Then he motioned her forward and smiled toward Asant Rao. And who else did you bring? Yet another old friend, Shirin salaamed lightly. I thank your Highness for still remembering me. I remember you very well. But the last I'd heard, Janahara had ordered you imprisoned. I'm astonished to see you still alive. I was released by Arangbar, Highness, after Samad was executed. She tried unsuccessfully to disguise the fatigue in her voice. I still do not know why. Perhaps it was his weakness for beauty. Jada smiled. But just now I think you need rest. Mumtaz has asked me to invite you to stay with her in the Zanana. Shirin stays with me. Hawksworth heard his own voice abruptly rising above his exhaustion. Jadar turned and studied him for a moment, then laughed out loud. Suddenly I understand many things. Mumtaz was right after all. Why is it women always seem to see these things so clearly? His gaze swept Hawksworth's tattered jerkin. Well, how are you, Captain Hawksworth? Still alive, I see, just as I foretold, and still the fashionable English ambassador. There is no other. Unfortunately, however, my mission was not a complete success. First, India must have a just rule, then aid can be conducted with an even hand. Jadar leaned back on his bolster. Tell me, Captain, have you seen enough of Agra and court intrigue to rethink the matter we once discussed? I've probably seen all of Agra I'll ever see. Hawksworth fixed Jadar squarely. But then I'll have much company. Jadar sobered and regarded Hawksworth a moment in silence. I see time still has not mellowed you, or taught you very much. Do you understand anything at all of land? Actics, see Captain Hawksworth? I've never claimed to, but I can count infantry. Jadar laughed again. You still amuse me, Captain. I'll never know why. It saddens me there'll be so few occasions for us to pass the time together during the next few days. But at least let me show you around my compound. You'll see the next Moghul of India does not campaign entirely like a destitute Arab. Why don't we start with your fortifications? Jadar roared as he lifted nimbly from his bolster throne and walked into the sunshine. Then he paused and turned to Shirin. Join us if you wish. And by the way, where have you decided to stay? Shirin looked at Hawksworth for a moment, and their eyes locked. He saw a smile flicker across her face. I'll stay with the English ambassador, Highness, as you wish. Jadar's tone was wistful. I no longer try to reason with the mind of a woman, but just let me caution you, if you stay among the Muslims here, their women will spit on you unless you put on a veil. They've never heard of Persia. Then we'll stay with the Rajputs. Shirin tossed her head and followed along as Jadar led them through a side exit in the interior chintz wall and into the outer perimeter of the compound. The kettledrums thundered Jadar's exit. This side is for food, Captain. Jadar gestured toward a row of ornate tents that lined the inside of the chintz walls. The first is for fruit and melons. No man can campaign without them, particularly if he has a hungry Zanana. The tent over there is for making sharbat, and that one is for keeping betel leaves to make pan. Jadar smiled. Try denying a woman her betel, and you'll have nothing but squabbles." He led them on, pointing as he walked. "The large tent there is the kitchen, the one beyond it the bakery, and the one past that for grinding spices." Hawkesworth found himself astonished. Who could lead an army amid such extravagance? The tents were all red satin, with gilded poles around the outside, giving them the appearance of luxurious pavilions. Some, like the one for fruits and melons, were raised on a platform above the grow, and while others were two-story, with an interior stair. As he watched the servants scurry from tent to tent bearing silver trays, he found it difficult to remember a war was looming. You'll soon discover traveling with women is always bird. In some, captain. For example, on the other side of the Moghul bar, I've had to erect a special tent just for their perfumes, another for their tailors, another to hold their wardrobes. Then there's a tent for mattresses, one for basins, and one for lamps and oil. These women rule my life. The things I really need: workshops, guardhouses, my arsenal I've had to situate back behind the zenana, near where the serving women stay. Jadar paused, his eyes gleaming mischievously. "Well, what do you think?" "I think an army camp should have fewer women and more men." Jadar laughed and looked pointedly at Shirin. "But what is life without women, Captain? Wives don't travel with an army in Europe." "Then Europe could earn something from India, about fighting or about women. Before you're through, you may learn a few things about both." Jadar turned and started back down the row of tents. "War here is very different from wars on the seas, Captain. You would see my men fight before you judge them. But my question now is whether you know how to fight well enough to be of any help. Tell me, can you handle a bow? Armies don't use bows in England anymore. I've certainly never used one. I think the last time bows were issued for battle was back around the time of the Spanish Armada, about 30 years ago. Some of the local forces in Devonshire equipped 800 men with longbows." Jadar paused uncertainly. "What do you mean by longbow?" "It's a bow about 5 feet in length. The best ones are made of yew, but they're also made from ash and elm." "You mean your bows are made entirely from wood?" Jadar's voice betrayed his skepticism. "What weight did they pull?" "I don't know exactly, but they were powerful enough. You can draw a longbow all the way back to your ear. During the time of King Harry, it was forbidden to practice with a longbow using a range less than a full furlong. The English longbow drove the crossbow right out of Europe. I've heard it said a longbow can pierce a 4-inch thick oak door." "But you don't use them now?" "We prefer muskets." He seemed to ponder the answer as he led them back into his pitted reception area. He took his place beneath the canopy, then turned to Hawkesworth. "We use muskets too, but frankly they're often more trouble than they're worth. They're cumbersome and inaccurate, and while you're reloading and priming your match, like a Rajput archer will put half a dozen arrows through you. Infantry here normally is 1/3 matchlock men and 2/3 archers. If you're going to be any help to us, Captain, you'll need to learn to use a bow." Jadar stopped and turned to look at Shirin. Her eyes were fluttering with fatigue. "But I forget my manners. You must have some rest while we teach the Ferengi how to fight. Perhaps the best thing would be to clear a tent for you at the rear of the Moghul bar, near the workshops, and the English captain can stay there too," Jadar laughed, "so I can watch him practice his bow." He glanced back at Hawkesworth, and his eyes froze on the pearl earring. "I see you're a Khan now as well as an ambassador. Congratulations. If Arangbar can make you a Khan, I can surely make you an archer." Jadar motioned to the eunuchs, who came forward and escorted Shirin through the rear doorway of the compound. Hawkesworth was watching her leave, praying for sleep. Himself, when Jadar's voice brought him back. "Let me begin by explaining our Indian bow to you, Captain. I think it's probably quite different from the English bow you described." Jadar turned to Vasant Rao and motioned toward his quiver, a flat leather case hanging from a strap over one shoulder. It was covered with gold embossing and held both his bow and his arrows. "You know we have a proverb. The sword is better than the katar, the spear is better than the sword, the arrow better than the spear. I've heard Muslims claim the bow and arrow were first given to Adam by the Archangel Gabriel." Jadar paused while Vasant Rao took out his bow and passed it over. "Now, the first thing you need to learn is how to string this. It's more difficult than you might suppose, since a bow is reflexed, curved back around the opposite way when unstrung. It's stressed against the strung position to give it more weight on the pull. Jadar examined the bow for a moment. In fact, you can tell how much use a bow has had by the way it's bent when unstrung. The original curve in this bow is almost gone, which means it's had a lot of use. Here, hold it for a moment. Hawksworth grasped the bow in his hand. It was some 4 feet long, shaped in a wide curve with the ends bent back. The grip was velvet, with a gold embossed design on the inner side. You say your English bows are made of wood, but I find that difficult to believe. This one is a composite, a mango wood core with strips of buffalo horn glued over the outside. And the outer curve is lined with catgut to give it even more force. That's why this bow had to be sealed on the outside with leather. We use leather or lacquer to protect the glue from the dampness of the monsoon. The string, by the way, is a silk skein with a crisscross binding at the center. How do you string it? Jadar grinned as he took back the bow. It's not easy. If you have to string a bow while riding, you hook one end between the stirrup and the instep of your foot and brace it backward against your knee. But usually we bend it over our back. He took the string in his hand and slipped the bow around his waist. Then he flipped it against his back and pulled its free end over his left shoulder, inverting the curve and hooking the string in a single motion. It was done in an instant. There. But I've made it look easier than it is. You should practice, and it would also be well if you could learn to string a bow and shoot from horseback. Horseback? All horsemen use a bow. How can you possibly hit anything from horseback? Practice. A good Rajput archer can shoot as well from horseback as standing. The Uzbeks shoot better. As Jadar spoke, he was extracting a heavy ring from inside his cloak. One side of the ring was a green emerald, flat and square and half an inch wide. This is a zikir, a bow ring to protect your thumb when you draw. It also increases your range. He pushed the emerald ring over his thumb, notched an arrow into the string, and drew it back effortlessly, holding the thin bamboo arrow in position with a touch of his forefinger. The whole sequence had taken less than a second. Hawksworth found himself staring in admiration. By the way, Jadar turned to Vasant Rao, show him how you shoot under a shield. The Rajput turned to one of Jadar's guards, whose shield was hanging loosely from a older strap. He took the shield and slipped it onto his wrist. It was circular, a 1/4 inch thick and about 2 feet in diameter and curved like a wide bowl. The front was figured with a silver ensign, and in the center were 4 steel nail heads, which secured the hand grips on the back. That shield's one of the best. It's made with cured rhino hide and toughened with lacquer. You hold it by those 2 straps attached inside, there in the center. Jadar pointed as Vasant Rao held out the back of the shield. Notice the straps are large and loose, so when you want to shoot, you can slip your hand through and slide the shield up your wrist, like he's doing now. Then your hand extends out beyond the rim and you can hold the grip of the bow. But remember, you'll have no protection when shooting, so you'll learn to shoot fast or you won't live long in a battle. Here, try the shield. Hawksworth took the shield and gripped the leather thongs on the back. It's light. How much protection does it give? A buffalo hide shield is really only effective against arrows, but a rhino hide shield like this one will usually deflect musket fire. We'll find a rhino shield for you somewhere. Jadar rose to leave. Incidentally, after seeing how you handle that bow, I think I'd better assign you to the guards stationed back with the Zenana. That should keep you well out of the battle. I don't want my first English ambassador dead just yet. He fingered his long pearl necklace and studied Hawksworth. You may be interested to know my reports say the Imperial Army will reach us in 2 days. Tomorrow, I plan to poison all the tanks and water wells within 20 kos east of here, forcing them to attack immediately. I hope you'll be ready. He turned and was gone. Hawksworth awoke at noon the following day to discover work had begun on fortification of the camp. He left Shirin sleeping and walked to the eastern perimeter, where the heavy cannon were being drawn into position. As he paused to study one of the cannon, he found himself comparing it with the European design. It looked to be a 6-inch bore, with a molded iron barrel strengthened by brass hoops shrunk. Around the outside, it was bolted onto its own carriage, a flat base supported by 4 solid wooden wheels and pulled by a team of 10 white bullocks yoked in pairs. Cotton ropes almost 2 inches in diameter were tied around the breech, looped beneath the axles, and then through a heavy iron ring on the front of the mount, extending forward to hooks on the yokes of the bullocks. While their drivers whipped the animals forward, a crowd of moustachioed infantry in red and gris and tunics clustered around the gun carriages, pushing. A drummer in an orange cloak sat astraddle the breech of the cannon, beating cadence for the other men on 2 large drums strapped along each side of the barrel. A large bull elephant trailed behind, heavy padding on his forehead, and whenever the gun carriage bogged, the elephant would be moved forward to shove the breech with his head. As the cannon were rolled into position, some 15 feet apart, they were being linked to each other, with heavy ropes of twisted bull hide the size and strength of metal chain, to prevent cavalry from riding through and cutting down the gunners. After the hide ropes were camouflaged with brush, a leather screen was placed behind the breech of each gun to protect the gunners when it fired. Hawksworth counted approximately 300 cannon along the camp perimeter. Fire pots were being stationed behind each gun, together with linstocks and leather barrels of powder. A few bags of earth had been piled between some of the cannon to provide protection for matchlock men. Around the cannon, men were assembling piles of 4-sided iron claws, and beyond, diggers with picks and wicker baskets had begun a half-hearted effort to start construction of a trench. He studied the preparations uneasily for a moment, sensing something was wrong, and then he froze. There was no shot, only stacks of iron claws. He whirled and made his way back to the munitions depot rows of yellow-fringed tents. The shot was there waiting, in gauge ranging from 2-inch to 10-inch, but none had been moved. He moved on to other tents and discovered several hundred more cannon. Some were the same gauge as those being deployed, others much larger. All had been fitted with harness, ready to be moved, but now they stood in long rows, waiting. As he moved onto another row of tents, pushing through the swarm of men and bullocks, he discovered a vast cache of smaller cannon. And thousands, also mounted on wooden carriages, but small enough to be moved by a bullock, or even 2 men. These 2 were harnessed and sat untouched. Beyond there were other rows of tents, where 7-foot-long muskets together with powder, ags of shot, and a wooden prong to rest the barrel on when firing were now being broken out and distributed to the infantry. The men were being armed, but the camp itself was practically without fortification. Hawksworth stood brooding about the preparations, about the Rajput horn, though he had only barely learned to use. He was finally able to hit the Tada practice target, a mound of earth piled near Jadar's officer's tent. But shooting under a shield seemed impossible, and the situation began to overwhelm him. Jadar's position was becoming more hopeless by the minute. He stared around the open camp and decided he would try to requisition as many matchlocks as possible, and perhaps also try to teach Shirin to shoot in the time remaining. If they had muskets, he told himself, perhaps they could somehow defend themselves when the Imperial army swept through the camp. He turned and pushed his way back toward where muskets were being issued. Men were walking past him carrying heavy matchlocks, 5 feet in length, with a barrel of rolled steel welded together end to end. The barrel was attached to the stock by a broad steel band, and both were profusely ornamented with embossing and colored enamel. Some of the muskets had wooden tripods attached to the end of the barrel. As he approached the munitions tent, he saw Vasant Rao standing in its center, issuing orders with an easy smile, his mustache and turb and as prim as though he were on muster. Behind him was a head-high pile of muskets, each wrapped in a roll of green broadcloth. Hawksworth stared at him for a moment, then pushed forward. Through the shouting mob, he finally managed to catch the Rajput's arm and pull him toward the rear of the open tent. Why aren't the cannon being deployed? But they are, Captain. Vasant Rao stroked his mustache and looked past Hawksworth's shoulder toward the next stack of matchlocks. But oh, Only the medium-bore guns, and even those have no shot. Nothing else has been moved. By medium-bore, I assume you mean the Gaucash, the ox-drawn cannon. That's true. But these things all take time. You're spending what little time you have left. Deploying medium-bore cannon, and those with no shot. Who the hell is in charge? Prince Jadar, of course. The Gaucash cannon are the key to his strategy. Vasant Rao moved past Hawksworth and barked orders for the next stack of skits to be unstrapped. Waiting infantrymen in ragged cloaks pushed forward. Take a musket, Captain, if you want one. They're probably of some small use. When I'm finished here, I have to check all the harness on the Filcash cannon, the large. Guns that will be drawn into position by elephants. Then I still have to issue the Mardamcash guns, the small cannon that are assigned to two-man teams. Where will this other artillery be deployed? Hawksworth shouted toward Vasant Rao's back. The Rajput seemed not to hear, as he paused to speak to one of the men assisting him. Then he turned and unwrapped a musket, selected a tripod, and passed both to Hawksworth. The other man was bringing a wide velvet belt from the back of the tent, and he handed it to Hawksworth. Hanging from it were a powder flask, bullet pouch, priming horn, match cord, and flint and steel. The prince will issue orders for deployment of the Filcash and Mardamcash guns after they've all been harnessed. He'd better issue them soon. It'll start growing dark in a couple of hours, 3 at most. I'm sure he's aware of the time, Captain. Vasant Rao turned and disappeared into a circle of bearded Rajputs, barking orders. Hawksworth watched him disappear, then turned and grabbed 2 more muskets. Holding them ahead of him like a prow, he pushed his way back into the milling street. The air was rank with sweat, and the crowd seemed more disorganized than ever. Jostled in the streets, haggling with the merchants for clay jars of oil, while grooms moved among them leading prancing horses, each wearing a gold-fringed saddle blanket that glowed like ancient coin in the waning sun. Hawksworth studied the crowd, searching vainly for some sense of organization, then turned to begin working his way back toward Jadar's compound and his own tent. Shirin was still there, asleep. He stood admiring her again, her soft mouth the live skin of her high cheeks, her shining dark hair, and realized he loved her more than ever. Dear God, we've only just begun to live. Jadar is a madman. Almost without knowing why, he began to rummage through the remains of his claw. The thing still rolled in the carpet and lying where he had thrown it. His pulse suddenly quickened when his fingers closed around a hard, round object. It was his very last bottle of brandy, miraculously entangled in the remains of his form. Old doublet, if there was ever a time. He ripped away the rotting cork with his teeth and pulled deeply on the brandy twice. As always, it seemed to work at the knot in his gut. He took one more swallow, then shook Shirin. She startled ache and stared at him wildly for a second. Then she broke into a smile until she saw the brandy. You really need that now? I need this and a lot more. How can you sleep? This whole god-cursed camp is going to be leveled by the Imperial Army in a few hours. He stopped and stared at her. Are you listening? Only a fraction of Jadar's cannon are deployed. Most are still waiting to be pulled into position. It's unbelievable. Shirin pulled herself up and leaned again. Bolster, examining him with weary eyes. Then why are you here? I thought you'd decided to help Prince Jadar. How can anyone help him when he won't help himself? Hawksworth took another burning mouthful of brandy and stared at his bow quiver lying on the carpet. In a fit of disgust, he kicked it toward the center of the tent. Shirin watched the bow fall and laughed. Have you mastered your Rajput bow yet? No. And what does it matter? You know Jadar is outnumbered 3-1. Hawksworth pointed toward the muskets he had leaned against a coil of rope by the tent pole. I've got 3 weapons for us. You think you can shoot a matchlock? I can shoot a bow. She dismissed the muskets with a glance. I sincerely hope you've learned enough to shoot one too. A trumpet sounded from the center of the compound. Immediately it was answered by others the length of the camp. Shirin snapped alert and rose off the bolster, pulling her gauze cloak around her waist. That's the signal to begin preparing the firewood. Come, at least you can help with that. Hawksworth examined her aghast. Firewood? What in God's name are you talking about? Is Jadar planning to light fires? Is he worried the Imperial Army won't find our camp? He turned and walked to the doorway, rubbing his brow in disbelief. I think there's damned small risk of that. The red tents of his Zenana can be seen for miles. Shirin laughed and pushed her way ahead of him. Past the portiere of the tent, servants had already begun assembling piles of logs along the center of the walkway that ran the length of the compound. Hawksworth stood at the doorway and stared in astonishment as clay jars of oil were carried from the kitchen tent and stationed near the logs. As he watched, he noticed the long shadows of dusk beginning to play across the walls of nearby tents. He turned to retrieve the brandy, and when he emerged again from the tent, Shirin was lost among the crowd of servants bringing wood. He slipped the bottle into his jerkin and started working his way down the side of the compound, back toward the munitions tent. Pairs of elephants had been harnessed to the larger cannon. And how they were being led out of the camp, into the dusk. Following these were camels with 2-pound swivel guns mounted on their backs, together with infantry pulling the smaller guns after them on 2-wheeled carriages. Bullock carts heaving with pow. Duran shot came after. Pyramids of firewood were scattered among the tents, and already many of the Rajputs had assembled by the unlit piles, talking and embracing. Some had seated themselves and removed their turbans, chanting verses from the Bhagavad Gita as they began to oil and comb their long black hair. Hawksworth watched silently as they started passing around inlaid teakwood boxes, taking and eating handfuls of small brown balls. As he stood puzzling, he recognized Asant Rao standing among the men. The Rajput was Samar now, clasping each of the men in what seemed a farewell gesture. He looked up and saw Hawksworth and smiled. Captain Hawksworth, I'm glad you're here. You're almost a Rajput yourself. Now, do you want to comb your hair? It's how we prepare for what may happen. Who knows which of us will see the morrow? I can die just as well with my hair the way it is. Then you're not entirely a Rajput after all, but you're still welcome to join us. He held out one of the boxes. Hawksworth opened the box and gingerly took out one of the balls. As he rolled it under his nose, it triggered a distant memory of his first night in Surat and Mukarab Khan's dinner party. Suddenly he stopped dead still. It was opium. Jesus Christ, have you all gone mad? He flung the ball to the ground and whirled on Vasant Rao. That's the last thing you need if you hope to fight at all. It's like eating death. A Fian prepares a Rajput for battle, Captain. The more we eat, the stronger we become. It gives us the strength of lions. Good Jesus help us all. Hawksworth pushed his way incredulously back through the milling crowd of infantry and mounted cavalry, feeling as though the world had collapsed. All around him Rajputs were eating handfuls of opium, combing their hair, embracing in farewell. Many had already put on their kaftan, the quilted vest they wore under their armor. I wondered how long it would be before they became drunk with opium and began killing each other. God, we're all going to die. Can't Jadar stop it? Can't he at least stop them from eating opium before we're attacked? And where are they, Moving the cannon, out of the camp? What the hell is happening? He wheeled and headed for the Nakarakhana, the entry to Jadar's compound. When he reached it, he realized the guards were gone. Amazed, he walked through the entry and discovered all the interior partitions of the Gulal bar were also gone. The satin tents that had held the melons, the pan leaves, the kitchen all were deserted, empty. He made his way on through the deserted Gulal bar, feeling like a man lost. In the dark. There were no guards, no troops, nothing. Ahead he heard the sound of elephants trumpeting, and he felt his way forward through the semi-darkness, the ground a mosaic of flickering shadows from the still-burning camp light. His despair absolute. He reached into the pocket of his jerkin for the bottle. A catarrh was at his throat. It's forbidden by death to draw a weapon in the Gulal bar, Captain. I was only. There was an explosion of laughter, and he turned to see the shadowed Fae. Subjadar, what are you doing here? Thinking, Captain Hawksworth. Do you never think before a battle at sea? Surely you must. I think, and I also keep my gunners sober. Hawksworth felt vaguely foolish as he finished extracting the brandy bottle. You know half your men are eating handfuls of opium. I'm glad to hear it. It means my Rajputs will be invincible tomorrow. Jadar flipped the katar in his hand and dropped it into his leather sheath. By the way, I understand you failed to master the bow. But let's talk about something more important. Perhaps you can be of help after all. I'm sure you realize, Captain, that a commander must always understand two things. He must know his own strengths, and he must know the strengths of those who oppose him. But he can really only know one of these for sure. He can never know exactly what he will meet. Jadar paused. Tell me, if you were Inayat Latif, how would you deploy the Imperial Army tomorrow? What do you mean? How would you choose to attack? The position of infantry, cavalry, elephants is never exactly the same in any battle. For example, often the front line is held by rows of infantry. The first row will be men wearing plate armor, which is much heavier than the usual steel netting, forming a protective wall with special broad shields. They are always excellent archers. Behind these will be another row, wearing only helmets and breastplates and armed with swords and pikes. The third row is infantry with swords, bows, and axes. The fourth carries lances and swords. The rows are segmented, so those behind can see ahead and cavalry can get through. That deploy would mean a slow-moving attack and a very bloody fight. Precisely. That's why many commanders prefer to use their cavalry as the vanguard. Horsemen can move faster, and they can more easily avoid defense barricades. Hawksworth looked at Jadar, wishing he could see his eyes. But cavalry can be cut to ribbons with small artillery. Is it wise to charge with your cavalry if your enemy has heavy gun emplacements? He heard Jadar laugh. You may make a commander yet. You. See, Inayat Latif will naturally assume our camp is heavily defended. Now, although it's considered questionable manners to attack a camp at night, your manners become excusable if you attack at early dawn, even though it's still dark. I've known of attacks occurring almost half a pahar before dawn. What's that in European measure? An hour and a half. But if it's still dark, how can you see the enemy's lines? You can see them if your enemy's camp has been negligent enough to leave a few fires burning. Jadar smiled as he paused to let the words sink. But now let's examine the third possibility, leading the attack with your elephants. Elephant armor is steel plate, and it can withstand everything except heavy cannon. If you can entice your foe into firing his biggest artillery before you charge, then you can send a wave of war elephants and devastate his gunners before their cannon cool enough to reload. Since it can take at least a pahar for a large cannon to cool, large guns are rarely fired more than once in a battle, and never after your cavalry has moved out. Leading the vanguard with war elephants always entails danger, since if they panic, they can earn around and trample your own infantry, but in this case it's probably worth the risk. And you think that's what Inayat Latif will try to do? Hawksworth absently twirled the brandy bottle in his hand. I'm asking you. It sounds the most plausible. He'll position his biggest cannon to fire into the camp, and after he's drawn your fire in return, he'll stampede about 1,000 war elephants right through here, crushing everything in their path, including your opium-sodded Rajputs and their invincible bows. You're doing remarkably well so far, Captain. Jadar took Hawksworth's arm and guided him toward the back of the compound. And then what would you do? I'd send an infantry wave right after the war. Elephants with lines so thick it would be a wall of death. And behind them I'd have cavalry with muskets to contain the camp and meet your own cavalry when it broke through, as it probably would eventually. Cavalrymen wouldn't bother with muskie. It's just bows, but you're still thinking very clearly. Now tell me, from what direction would you attack this particular camp? They were approaching the tents, where servants were beginning to soak the wood piles with oil. Hawksworth found himself astonished that Jadar would listen calmly to the strategy spelling his own destruction. From the east, the way we came in. And why that particular direction? Several reasons. Hawksworth tried to remember the terrain as they came into the camp. First, if I'd marched from the east, I'd already have my army deployed there. Second, and probably more important, it's the only direction that's really accessible. The other sides are too forested. But from the east, there's a wide clearing that funnels down right into the perimeter of the camp, with a very clear demarcation of forest on each side, which helps keep your army grouped. Correct. And also, the sun would not be in my men's eyes if I hit you from the east. Adar stopped and looked at him. So that is precisely what you would do? Attack at dawn on the eastern perimeter, and lead with a front line of war elephants. With the biggest and best I had, Jadar sighed. You know, it troubles me that a Ringhe would conclude the same thing I have. But I think it's a classic problem. And that will dictate a classic solution in the mind of Inayat Latif, whose alleged brilliance does not include a flair for originality. He'll have to mount a conventional attack. What's more, because of the restricted terrain, he'll have no room to split his army into a right wing and a left wing. There'll have to be a single phalanx. That's dangerous if you ever need to retreat, but he'll not even consider that possibility. And you say you also believe he'll hold his cavalry for the third wave. Jadar paused. That's more important here than you probably realize. Everything else depends on it. The cavalry must attack last. It seems. And his cavalry is mainly Rajput. He'll not risk cutting up his finest troops by sending them in the first attack wave when your artillery is still in place. Hawksworth hesitated, then continued bitterly. Or should be, Jadar. Laughed and looked at Hawksworth, then at his bottle. What's that in your hand, Captain? A bottle of brandy. Spanish, I'm ashamed to admit, but it's still the best. May I try it? Jadar took the bottle and gingerly swallowed a swig. He stood motionless for a moment and then coughed violently. Merciful Allah, now I understand why the Prophet forbade its use. He shoved back the bottle. But I wanted to drink once with you, Captain. I'm told it's a European custom. You've eased my mind. Eased your mind? I just told you how your camp will be devastated at sunrise. Absolutely. I will regret losing these tents. Jadar's tone grew pensive. You know, some of them have been with me since my first campaign in the Deccan years ago. How about your Rajputs and your women? Will you regret losing them as much as your tents? I don't expect to lose them. Jadar took Hawksworth's arm and led him around the last tent. In the firelight, baggage elephants were being loaded with women from the Zenana. The elephants were covered with Pakar armor, steel plates around the sides of their bodies, and a special steel casement for their head and trunk. The women were being helped up to all ladders and into their elephant's howdah, an octagonal box of heavy boards strengthened with iron plate. Why are you loading the women now? But we're leaving, Captain. Hawksworth stared at him speechlessly for a moment, then noticed Shirin walking toward them, carrying a bow and 2 quivers of arrows. You're leaving? You just predicted this camp would be devastated. I agree with you entirely. In fact, I planned it that way. So why should anyone be here when it happens? The camp will be empty by dawn, Captain. Naturally, we had to wait until dark to move out, and continue work on the trenches until the very end. Inayat Latif undoubtedly has scouts all around. But by dawn, there'll only be smoldering fires here, and the troops needed to man our decoy cannon across the eastern perimeter. I've loaded half the cannon with elephant barbs made in my workshops, the other half with nothing. Why waste shot? We'll fire the blank cannon to induce them to charge, and after the elephants have come inside cannon range, we'll shoot the barbs in among them. A barb in the foot of an elephant can immobilize it completely. Inayat Latif will never expect barbs. They haven't been used in India for 50 years. His war elephants should be contained right out there, unable to advance or retreat. But where will your army be, Captain? Just when I thought you were beginning to understand tactics, my army will be waiting along both sides of the open plain on the east, behind a foliage camouflage we've been erecting over the past 2 weeks. After the attack force of Imperial war elephants has been funneled into the empty camp, we will open fire against them with our biggest cannon, from both sides. The medium-range cannon will fire into the infantry, as will the small artillery. All the guns should be in place just before dawn if I've timed it right. Hawksworth turned to see keepers leading an armored elephant forward for him and Sheeran. Only its ears could be seen behind the steel plate. Then he looked again at Jadar. But you're still outnumbered in infantry 3-1. All things in time, Captain. He turned and embraced Sheeran lightly. This was my best Swanenigger. Guard her well. Sheeran examined Hawksworth's brandy bottle with her dark eyes and laughed skeptically. I've brought my own bow. Hawksworth cleared his throat as he slipped the bottle back into his jerkin. I've requisitioned a brace of muskets. It's still the weapon I prefer. Congratulations, Captain. Jadar's laugh was cynical. I admire your Feringhi initiative, but I don't want to see you harmed. Like I told you, I'm sending you with the Zenana. They'll be moved to that hilltop there west of the camp, so at least you'll be able to watch the battle. He turned to leave. Farewell until tomorrow, Captain. May Allah ride with you. And I wish you Godspeed. You're a 10 times better strategist than I realized, for whatever it may be worth. Jadar laughed. Just save some of your foul-tasting Feringhi brandy for our victory celebration, and perhaps I'll drink with you one more time. His eyes darkened. If not, then tomorrow we'll be eating lamb side by side in paradise. Book 5, Prince Jadar, Chapter 28. A drum roll lifted across the dark plain, swelling in intensity like angry, caged thunder. It rose to fill the valley with a foreboding voice of death, then faded slowly to silence, gorged on its own immensity. That's the Imperial Army's call to arms. Prince Jadar was right. Inayat Latif is attacking now before dawn. Sheeran was seated next to Hawksworth in the dark howdah. She rose to peer over the 3-foot-high steel rim out into the blackness. Around them were the shapes of the Zenana Guard elephants, silently swinging their trunks beneath their armor. The Zenana waited farther back on female baggage elephants, surrounded by hundreds of bullock carts, aisled with clothing and utensils. Merciful Allah, he must have 1,000 war drums. You saw the size of the Imperial Army mustering at Fatehpur. Hawksworth rose to stand beside her, grasping the side of the rocking howdah and inhaling a cold morning air. The Queen had begun recalling Mansabdars and their troops from every province. Suddenly a chorus of battle horns cut through the dark, followed by the drums again, now a steady pulse that resounded off the wooded hills. Swelling in power. That's the signal for the men and cavalry to deploy themselves in battle array. Sheeran pointed toward the sound. The Imperial forces are almost ready. Below them, fires smoldered in Jadar's abandoned camp, 1,000 specks of winking light. Although the east was beginning to hint the first tinges of light, the valley where the Imperial Army had massed was still shrouded in black. The drums suddenly ceased, mantling the valley in eerie, portentous quiet. Hawksworth felt for Sheeran's hand and noticed it perspiring, even in the cold dawn air. From the eastern edge of Jadar's abandoned camp points of cannon fire erupted, tongues of light that divulged the length and location of the camp's defenses. A few moments later, less time than Hawksworth would have wished the sound reached them, dull pops, impotent and hollow. The firing lapsed increasingly sporadic, until the camp's weak perimeter defense seemed to exhaust itself like the last melancholy thrusts of a spent lover. The defense perimeter of the camp had betrayed itself, and in the tense silence that ensued Hawksworth knew the Imperial guns were being set. Suddenly, a wall of flame illuminated the center of the plain below, sending rockets of fire plunging toward the empty camp. Jesus, they're launching fireworks with cannon. What are they? I don't know. I've heard that cannon in India were once called naphtha throwers. A second volley followed hard after the first. Though this time no fireworks were hurtled, the impact was even more deadly. 40-pound Imperial shot ripped wide trenches through the flaming tents of the prince's camp. In moments, the Gulal Bar, where they had been standing only hours before, was devastated, an inferno of shredded cloth and billowing flame. A harsh chant began to drift upward from the valley, swelling as voices joined in unison. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, God is great. It was the battle cry of Yat Latif's Muslim infantry. The plain below had grown tinged with light now, as dawn approached and the fires from Jadar's camp spread. As Hawksworth watched, nervously gripping the handle of his sword, a force of steel-armored war elephants advanced on the eastern perimeter of the camp, their polished armor plate glowing red in the firelight. Those in the vanguard bore steel-shrouded howdahs, through which a single heavy cannon protruded. Probably a 10-pounder, Hawksworth told himself. The steel howdahs on the next rows of elephants were almost 3 feet high and perforated to allow their archers to shoot without rising above the open top. Sporadic cannon and matchlock fire from the few hundred men left in the camp pelted the elephants, but did nothing to impede their advance. Directly behind them, the Imperial infantry swept in dense, marshaled ranks. Jadar knew exactly what he was doing when he picked this terrain for the camp, Hawksworth told himself. He used it to set the terms for the battle. There's no room to maneuver. When they discover the camp is abandoned, the elephants can't retreat and regroup without crushing their own infantry. He slipped his arm around Shirin's waist and held her next to him. They watched as the Imperial war elephants crashed through the camp's outer edge, scarcely slowing at the ditch. When the elephants were at point-blank range, the specially loaded cannon along the perimeter opened fire, spraying a rain of steel barbs among them. Even from the hilltop, he could hear the clang of steel as the barbs ricocheted off their armor. We'll soon know if Jadar's plan has a chance. Can he contain the elephants there, or will they obliterate a camp, then regroup, and the first row of elephants suddenly reared chaotically, lashing out with their armored trunks and dismounting some of the gunners. As barbs caught in their feet, they trumpeted in pain and started to mill randomly in angry confusion, crushing several of the men they had thrown. Just as Jadar predicted, the deadly carpet of barbs had temporarily disrupted their advance. Their ranks were broken and their guns in disarray. Behind the elephants, the infantry still marched unaware, until the confusion in the elephant ranks began to disrupt their front lines. Gradually, the order in the infantry ranks completely disintegrated, as the men stopped to eye the milling war elephants ahead of them in growing fear and confusion. By a single cannon salvo, Jadar's men had robbed the attack of its momentum. Now's Jadar's moment. Hawksworth watched in growing admiration. Will he use it? As though in answer, a blare of trumpets from the hills on both sides of the plain suddenly electrified the morning air. As they died away, the woods opened wide with a single chorus, deep and throaty and unforgiving. Ram, ram. Ram, ram. Ram, ram. It was the ancient Rajput war cry, a blaze of fire from Jadar's camouflaged cannon shredded away the leafy blinds erected along the foot of the hills, sending a rain of 40-pound lead shot into the Imperial war elephants. Their disordered ranks erupted in tangled steel and blood. Seconds later, a volley by Jadar's small artillery ripped into the unsuspecting infantry mast behind the elephants, hurtling fragmented bodies and orphaned weapons spinning through the ranks. Finally came the fiery streaks of rockets, thin, foot-long iron tubes filled with gunpowder and set with a lighted fuse, many with a sword blade attached to the end, which cut in a deadly wave through the Imperial troops, slashing and exploding as they flew. A dense roll of Jadar's war drums sounded from both hillsides, and the first wave of Rajput cavalry, still bellowing their war cry, charged down on the disrupted Imperial forces, discharging volleys of arrows with mechanical precision. They wore steel net cloaks and helmet guards, and their horses were armored with woven steel netting encased in heavy quilting with a wide frontlet over the chest, a neck-length collar secured to the top of the bridle, and a body shroud over their sides and in quarters emblazoned with each man's family crest. The startled infantry turned to meet them, and in moments the air darkened with opposing arrows. From the hill above came the din of supporting matchlock fire from Jadar's own infantry. A Rajput cavalry plowed into the first rows of imperial infantry, with their long Neza lances held at arm's length high above their heads, thrusting downward as they rode. Veins fueled with opium, the Rajputs had forgotten all fear. They brushed aside imperial spears and swords and slaughtered with undisguised pleasure, as though each death endowed more honor to their dharma. Hawksworth's stomach knotted as he watched 1,000 men fall in less than a minute, while the Rajputs attacked. Rince's division of armored war elephants had emerged from their camouflage and begun advancing across the western edge of the plain, isolating the ragged remainder of the imperial elephants from the battlefield. Although Jadar had far fewer war elephants, they now were easily able to contain the shattered imperial forces. Hawksworth turned to watch as yet another wave of Jadar's cavalry bore down on the plain. These rode through the tangle of imperial infantry wielding long curved swords, killing any the first wave had missed. I'm not sure I believe what I'm seeing. Hawksworth peered through the dust and smoke boiling across the plain below. Jadar has already seized the advantage. He's immobilized their war elephant. It's their major advantage, and he timed the counterattack perfectly. The battle has only just begun. Sheeran took his hand for no reason at all and gripped it. And their major advantage was not elephants, but numbers, I fearful. Or him. Look there. She pointed toward the east, where the red sky now illuminated a vast sea of infantry, poised as reinforcements. The prince's Rajputs cannot stop them all. Prince Jadar does not have the forces to meet them. I think he will be defeated today badly. And if he dies, do we die with him? Perhaps not you, but they will surely kill me. And probably Mumtaz. Most certainly they have orders to kill his son, on the field below Jadar's. Cavalry fought as though possessed. Rajputs with 1, 2, even 3 arrows in their back continued to sound their war cry and take head after bearded head, until they finally slumped unconscious from the saddle. Riderless horses, many with their stomachs slashed open, could be seen running wildly through the imperial ranks, unused arrows still rattling in their saddle quivers. Waves of Jadar's infantry had begun pouring down from the hills following the cavalry. The men wore heavy leather helmets and a skirt of woven steel. A hood of steel netting hung down from each man's helmet, protecting his face and neck. They advanced firing volley after volley of arrows into the imperial infantry. When they reached the plain, they drew their long curved swords and, waving them above their heads, threw themselves into the forces of Inayat Latif. The field quickly became a vast arena of hand-to-hand combat, as inevitably happened when 2 Indian armies met with Jadar's. Forces badly outnumbered, Sheeran watched the slaughter in silence for a time, as though tallying the dead and dying on both sides, and then she turned her face away. Allah preserve us. Prince Jadar's Rajputs have eaten so much of I thing. They can fight even after they die, but their numbers are already shrinking. How long can they protect the prince? Where's he now? She turned back and peered through the dust on the field for a long moment. Then she pointed. He's on the field now. Air in the center. Do you see him? She paused. He's very courageous to take the field so early. It will inspire his men, but it's a very bad omen. Hawksworth squinted toward the east. He could barely make out a phalanx of elephants moving across the plains into the middle of the fiercest fighting. Several of the elephants had clusters of 2-pound swivel guns mounted on their backs. A few had rocket launchers, but most carried howdahs filled with Rajput archers. In the center moved a large black elephant, heavily armored and bearing a steel howdah decorated with ornate gilding. Standing erect in the howdah, beneath a huge embroidered umbrella, was the figure of Prince Jadar, loosing arrows in rhythmic sucks as the imperial infantry closed around him. Why is it a bad sign? It's unwise for the supreme commander of an army to expose himself so early in the battle. Sheeran was watching Jadar, transfixed. If he's killed, the battle will be over. All his troops will flee. Even his fearless Rajputs. That's the way in India. If he's lost, what do they have left to fight for? They will melt into the forest. In India, a commander must always be visible to his men standing above the armor of his howdah, so they'll know for certain he's alive. As the circle of elephants surrounding Jadar advanced through the field, a triple line of his Rajput infantry moved into place around him. He quickly became the focus of the battle, and the imperial infantry massed to encircle him, like the king in a game of chess. His protective buffer of elephants was coming under increasingly heavy attack. The advantage of surprise enjoyed by his original offensive was gone. Now he was clearly on the defensive. I think Jadar's starting to be in serious trouble. You were right. I don't know how much longer his circle of elephants can protect him. In the silence, he slowly turned to Shirin, and their eyes met. Nothing more was said because no more words were needed. She reached out and touched his lips, and a lifetime seemed to flow between them. Then he drew his sword and leaned over the edge of the howdah. Yes, with a single stroke he severed the tether rope tying their elephant. Their startled mahout turned and stared in disbelief. When Hawksworth shouted at him to start, he hesitated for a moment, then flung his barbed iron ankus into their howdah and plunged for the grass. Earth grabbed the ankus, but before he could move, the elephant lifted its trunk into the morning air and emitted a long, defiant trumpet. Then he plunged past the tethered Zenana elephants and broke into a gallop, eastward down the hill and directly toward the battle. Hawksworth staggered backward and grasped the side of the swaying howdah. How did he know? Prince Jadar didn't give us a baggage elephant. He gave us one of his personal war elephants, to protect you. He knows where he should be now. In only minutes, their elephant reached the edge of the plain and began advancing like a dreadnought through the swarm of imperial infantry, headed directly for Jadar. Any luckless infantryman caught in his path would be seized in his trunk and flung viciously aside or simply crushed beneath his feet. But how could he know Jadar's threatened? He knows. His whole life is to protect the prince. A steel arrowhead sang off the side of the howdah. Then another did into one of the wooden beams supporting the armor. Hawksworth grabbed Shirin and shoved her down, below the steel rim. She fell sprawling and turned to grab their bows. As Hawksworth took them and began to notch the string on each one, he noticed for the first time that Jadar had given them one of his combat howdahs, with firing holes all around the sides. War cries and sounds of steel on steel ranged around them as they advanced. But their elephant seemed oblivious, only beginning to slow when they approached the dense lines of imperial infantry encircling Jadar. Hawksworth found his bow ring and slipped it awkwardly over his right thumb. Then he strung an arrow and took aim through one of the firing holes. In the side of the howdah, the arrow sang off his thumb and glanced harmlessly against the steel net cloak of an imperial infantryman. The man looked up, then paused to aim an arrow at the howdah. It was a lethal decision. Their elephant turned and seized him as he took aim, flinging him down and crushing him under its foot with a single motion. At once, the imperial infantry again started to clear a path in front of them. Jesus, I see why elephants are so feared on a battlefield. Yes, but they cannot fight the entire battle. Shirin's voice trailed off as she stared through a hole in the side of the howdah. Suddenly her eyes flooded with fear. Oh, Allah, merciful Allah, look! A close-ranked formation of imperial horse. Men, perhaps 50 in number, was advancing toward them from the eastern perimeter of the plain. They wore body armor of black steel, and they ignored the infantry battling around them as they charged directly for the circle of Jadar's elephant. Who are they? I think they're Latif's special Bundella guards. I've only heard about them. His elephant must be near, and he's ordered them to attack. He must realize the prince is vulnerable now. He hopes to kill Prince Jadar in a quick action and so end the battle. She stared over the side of the steel howdah again. If they fail, then he will send his regular Rajput cavalry. What's so special about Bundellas? They're from the region of Bundelkhand, and their horses are said to be specially trained against elephants. The native Bundellas She ducked down and stared wildly around the howdah as an arrow grazed by. Where? The matchlocks? Hawksworth quickly pulled up one of the muskets and checked the pry. He passed it to Sheeran and took a second for himself. As he looked again over the top of the howdah, he saw the elephants guarding Jadar start turning to face the approaching horsemen. Their own elephant had now reached the defense lines, and it immediately assumed its normal place in the protective circle. Many of the approaching bundellas were already being cut down by the spears of the Rajput infantry, but over half managed to penetrate the outer defense perimeter and reach the circle of elephants. The horsemen immediately began firing rockets into Jadar's elephants from long bamboo tubes they carried, intending to frighten them and disrupt their ranks. As Hawksworth watched, 3 of Jadar's encircling war. Elephants shied skittishly away from the fireworks, creating a momentary opening in the line. Before the opening could be secured, 2 of the Bundela cavalry dashed through the space. Once inside the defense perimeter, they parted, one riding toward either side of Jadar's elephant. One of the horsemen took careful aim with his bow and shot a barbed arrow connected to a line deep into the steel net armor of the mahout seated on the neck of Jadar's elephant. The horseman quickly whipped the arrow's line around his saddle horn and reined his mount. The horse seemed to know exactly what was expected, as it instantly reared backward, unseating Jadar's mahout and toppling him into the dust. As the mahout fell, his steel ankus clanged against Jadar's howdah, momentarily distracting the prince. When he whirled to look for his mahout, the other Bundela spurred his stallion alongside the elephant's rump, lifting a heavy spear above his head. But instead of hurtling the spear toward Jadar, he turned and plunged it deep into the ground beside the elephant. Sheeran, what's he doing? How can? The horseman twirled his long reins around the shaft in a quick motion, tethering the horse. Then he balanced himself atop the saddle, unsheathed his sword, and with an agile leap landed on the armored rump of Jadar's elephant. He secured his balance in less than a second, then grabbed the side of Jadar's gilded howdah. Hawksworth stared spellbound as a rain of Rajput arrows glanced harmlessly off his black steel body armor. Now, Sheeran's voice was almost a scream, as though in a dream. Hawksworth leveled the long barrel of his matchlock against the rim of the howdah and took aim. The star felt alien and bulky in his grip, and its lacquer inlay smooth and cold. He saw Sheeran thrust her own musket alongside his own, struggling to keep its heavy barrel balanced. As the horseman raised his sword to plunge it into Jadar's exposed back, Hawksworth squeezed the gun's inlaid trigger. The stock kicked into his face, and a burst of black smoke momentarily blinded him. Sheeran's matchlock had discharged at the same moment, and he looked down as she tumbled backward against the padded side of the howdah, still grasping the gun's heavy stock. Then he heard a cheer from the Rajputs and turned in time to see the Bundela spin in a half-circle. Hawksworth realized one musket ball had caught him direct in the face, the other in the groin. He vainly reached to seize the side of Jadar's howdah to regain his balance, but his foot skidded and he slipped backward into a forest of Rajput spears. The flash of a sword took his head. Jadar hadn't ever seen him. That settles one debt, you cocky bastard. There were shouts from the other attackers still outside the defense perimeter, and 2 horsemen reined their mounts and charged toward Hawksworth and Sheeran. As they approached, the elephant began revolving to meet them. Hawksworth reached down and grabbed the last remaining musket and rose to fire. As he looked up, he stopped in astonishment, for a second refusing to believe what he saw. Both bundle-canned horses were advancing on, their hind legs rearing and bounding toward them in high leaps. He watched transfixed as one of the Bundelas discharged his bow past the neck of his horse, directly at the howdah. The arrow missed Sheeran's dust-covered hair by only inches. Hawksworth lifted his matchlock and leveled it against the rim, wondering for an instant whether to aim for the man or the horse. Then the matchlock blazed, and he watched the horseman buckle backward in the saddle, toppling into a circle of waiting Rajput swords. Suddenly the howdah shuddered, throwing him sprawling against the side. As he pulled himself up, he realized the other horse had secured its front feet against the side of their elephant. The Bundella was staring directly in his face. Pulling an arrow from his saddle quiver, the horseman's bow was already half drawn when Hawksworth heard the sing of a bowstring beside him. As he watched, the end of a shaft suddenly appeared in the right cheek of the Bundella, buried to the feathers. The horseman's own arrow slammed into the side of the howdah, and he reached to claw at his face with his saddle hand, forfeiting his grip. As he slipped backward off the rearing horse, the Rajput infantryman beheaded him in midair. Hawksworth turned to see Shirin drop her bow onto the floor of the howdah. She slumped against the steel side, her eyes glazed with incredulity at what she had done. They watched wordlessly as the perimeter of Jadar's elephants was again drawn together and sick. As the other horsemen were driven back, coherent defense barricade of concentric circles was gradually established around the prince. The outer perimeter was a line of Rajput infantry armed with long spears. Inside their line were Rajput swordsmen, who now had linked together the skirts of their long steel mesh cloaks to form a solid barrier. And inside these was the last defense line, the circle of armored war elephants. As their own elephant instinctively rejoined the line protecting Jadar, Hawksworth reached to touch Shirin's hand. As he did, he noticed her thumb was bleeding and realized for the first time she had not been supplied a bow ring. "I think we can hold off the infantry with the elephants, but I don't know how long." Her voice trailed off as he looked up at her face. She was leaning against the side of the howdah, pointing wordlessly toward the east. He turned to see a vast wave of the Imperial Rajput horsemen bearing in on their position. They numbered in the thousands. God Almighty. He reached weakly for another arrow, trying to count those remaining in the quiver and asking if he would live long enough to shoot them all. "It's over." Their battle cry lifted above the plain as the approaching cavalry neared the edge of the massed Imperial infantry, engulfing Jadar. They began advancing directly through the infantry, not slowing, heading straight for Jadar. Hawksworth notched an arrow and rose up in the howdah to take aim. He drew back the string and picked the man in the lead for the first arrow. As he sighted the Rajput's bearded face down the shaft, he suddenly froze. The Rajput had just driven the long point of his spear into an Imperial infantryman. Hawksworth lowered his bow in disbelief and stared as the approaching Imperial cavalry began cutting down their own infantry, taking heads as they rode toward Jadar, leaving a carpet of death in their bloody wake. Holy Jesus! What's happening? They're attacking their own troops. Are they sodded with opium too? Suddenly their chant of Ram Ram was taken up by the Rajputs surrounding Jadar, and they turned on the Imperial infantry nearest them with the ferocity of a woo. Did tiger. Today Allah took on the armor of a Rajput. Shirin slumped against the side of the howdah and dropped her bow. "I had prayed they would all one day join with the prince, but I never really believed it would happen." Jadar's circle of war elephants began to cut their way through the remaining infantry to join the Rajput forces, swivel guns blazing from their backs. In what seemed only minutes, his entourage merged with the vanguard of Rajput cavalry, and together they moved like a steel phalanx against the Imperial infantry reserves waiting in the east. Hawksworth watched as the Imperial lines were cut, separating the infantry fighting on the plain from their reserves. Next, a corps of Rajput horsemen wielding long spears overran the Imperial gun emplacements, then grouped to assault the Imperial command post. When the elephant bearing the banner of Inayat Latif started for higher ground, discipline in the Imperial ranks evaporated. By late afternoon, the outcome was no longer in question. A final attempt by the Imperial forces to regroup disintegrated into a rout, with thousands of fleeing Imperial infantry falling before the swords and spears of the Rajput cavalry. Only the merciful descent of dark enabled Inayat Latif and his Imperial commanders to escape death at the hands of pursuing Rajput archers. As Hawksworth rode with Jadar's entourage through the dusty, smoke-shrouded battlefield, headed back for the camp, he felt he was witnessing the gaping mouth of hell. The plain was littered with the bodies of almost 40,000 men and over 10,000 horses. The proud war cries were forgotten. Through the dusky twilight came the plaintive moans of dying men and the shrill neighing of shattered horses. Rajputs moved among the bodies, plundering the dead enemy, searching for fallen comrades, dispatching with their long swords any lingering men or horses who could not be saved. All because of Jadar, Hawksworth thought, and his stomach sickened. Now what will happen? Jadar won the day in this valley in the middle of nowhere, but the Moghul is still in Agra, and tonight he still rules India. And I think he'll still rule India, if only in name, till the day he dies. Jadar can't march against the Red Fort in Agra, not with this ragtag army. Even his division of Rajput defectors couldn't storm that fortress. I'm not sure God himself could. Take the Red Fort. So what now, noble Prince Jadar? So far you've merely brought death to half the fighting men in India. The torchbearers marching 4 abreast at the front of their elephants were now approaching the remains of the camp. Through the flickering light emerged the vision of a burned-out ruin. Scorched furrows from the first imperial cannonade trailed through the few remaining tents. Small clusters of wounded men, some begging for water and some for death, were being fed opium, and their wounds wrapped with the shreds of ripped-apart tents. Jadar moved through the camp, acknowledging the triumphant cheers of his men. Ahead, his servants were already erecting a new chintz wall around the Gulal bar, and replacing the tents for the zenana. Hawksworth watched as carpets were unrolled from bullock carts and carried inside the compound. Jadar's elephant proceeded instinctively to the very entry of the Gulal bar, where it kneeled for him to dismount. Around him, Rajputs pushed forward to cheer and teslim. As he stood acknowledging them, the other elephants also began to kneel. Jadar's servants rushed forward to help Hawksworth and Shirin alight. This was the most horrible day I've ever known. Her arms closed around his neck as her feet touched ground, and she held him for a long moment, tears staining her cheeks. I've never before seen so much killing. I pray to Allah I never see it again. Hawksworth turned her embrace, then looked at her sadly. There'll be a lot more before Jadar sees Agra, if he ever does. This is just one battle, not the war. I'm not sure we want to be here to find out how it ends. She looked back at it, and smiled wistfully in silence. Then she turned and performed the teslim to Jadar. The prince was scarcely recognizable. His helmet had been torn by countless arrows or matchlock fire, and his haughty face and beard were smeared with dust and smoke. The emerald bow ring was missing from his right thumb, which was now caked with blood. Beneath his armor, the torn leather of his right sleeve was stained blood-dark, where he had ripped out an arrow. As he lifted his arms to acknowledge the rising cheers, his eyes were shadowed and tired, but they betrayed no pain. Hawksworth turned and examined Jadar's howdah. It was a forest of arrows and broken spear shafts. Grooms from the stables had already brought water and shug, a cane for his elephant, and begun extracting iron arrowheads from its legs, and from a section of its right shoulder where its armor had been shot away. As he watched the scene, Hawksworth slowly became aware of a pathway being cleared through the camp toward the east. Next, the cheers of some of Jadar's Rajputs began to swell through the smoky air. Through the encroaching dark, there slowly emerged the form of another elephant approaching. In the torchlight, he could tell it was regal in eyes and bore a gilded howdah shaded by a wide brocade umbrella. There were no arrows in the side of this howdah, nor was there more than a trace of dust on the elephant's gilded and enameled armor, with its elaborate decoration of swinging yak ales and tinkling bells. It seemed more suited for a royal procession than for a battlefield. Jadar watched impassively as the elephant neared the center of the clearing. While the Rajputs around him stood at attention, the elephant performed a small bow, then began to kneel with practiced dignity. Several Rajputs rushed forward to help the rider alight. The man's jeweled turban and rows of finger rings sparkled in the torchlight. As he moved directly toward Jadar, Hawksworth suddenly recognized the walk and caught his breath. It was Nadir Sharif. The Prime Minister paused a few feet from Jadar and salaamed lightly. He did not teslim, nor did he speak. As he stood waiting, from out of the darkness of the Gyulul, the figure of a woman emerged. She was veiled, surrounded by her women, and accompanied by a line of eunuchs wearing sheathed scimitars in their waist sash. She stopped and performed the teslim to Jadar. Then she turned to Nadir Sharif. He stared at her for a long moment, then said something in Persian. Without a word, she lifted her veil and threw it back. Next, she turned and gestured to one of the servants standing behind her. The servant stepped forward with a bundle wrapped in a brocade satin blanket and carried it directly to Nadir Sharif. The Prime Minister stood for a moment as though unsure whether to take it. Finally, he reached out and lifted the blanket from the servant and cradled it against one arm. He stared down for a long moment, his eyes seeming to cloud, and then he pushed back part of the blanket to examine its contents more closely. With a withered finger, he reached in and stroked something inside the blanket. Then he looked up and smiled and said something to Jadar in Persian. The prince laughed and strolled to his side, taking the blanket in his own smoke-smeared hands and peering down into it with Nadir Sharif. They exchanged more words in Persian, laughed again, and then Nadir Sharif walked to the waiting woman, whose dark eyes now brimmed with joy. He stood looking at her for a long moment, then spoke to her in Persian and enfolded her in his arms. A cheer went up again from the onlookers as they pushed forward to watch. Hawksworth turned to Shirin. "Is that who I think it is?" Shirin nodded, her eyes misting. "It's Mumtaz, the first wife of Prince Jadar and the only daughter of Nadir Sharif. He told Prince Jadar he decided. Today, he wanted to see his grandson, since he wanted to see the face of the child who would be Moghul himself one day. Then he told Mumtaz he will die in peace now, knowing that his blood will someday flow in the veins of the Moghul. Of India." Shirin's voice started to choke. "I can't tell you what this moment means. It's the beginning of just rule for India. Nadir Sharif knew that if Prince Jadar was defeated today, the child would be murdered by Janahara. In defecting with his Rajputs, he saved Prince Jadar, and he saved his grandson." She paused again. "And he saved us too. When do you think he decided to do this?" "I don't know. I still can't believe it's true." Hawksworth stopped for a moment, then whirled and seized her arm. "Jadar knew. By Jesus, he knew last night. The cavalry. He said the cavalry had to be held to the last. He knew they would turn on the Imperial infantry if he began to lose. He knew. All along." Shirin examined him with a curious expression. "I wonder if Mumtaz herself planned it. Perhaps she convinced Nadir Sharif to save his grandson." She paused. This must have been the most closely guarded secret in all of Agra. Nadir Sharif somehow kept even the queen from knowing he would defect with the Rajputs, or she would have surely killed him. Shirin's voice trailed off as she pondered the implications. "He's astonishing. Janahara has never entirely trusted him, but somehow he must have convinced her to let him command the Rajput cavalry. What did he do to make her finally trust him?" Nadir Sharif embraced Mumtaz once more, then bowed lightly again to Jadar and turned to leave. As his glance swept the torchlit crowd, he noticed Hawksworth. He stopped for a second, as though not believing what he saw, then broke into a wide smile. "By the beard of the Prophet, can it be? My old guest." He moved toward Hawksworth, seeming not to notice Shirin. "May Allah preserve you, Ambassador. Everyone at court thinks you've fled India. For your sake, I almost wish you had. What in God's name are you doing here?" "Someone tried to murder me at Fatehpur." Hawksworth turned and took Shirin's arm. "And Shirin, it seemed like a good time to switch sides. Someone actually tried to kill you. I do hope you're jesting with me." "Not at all. If Vasant Rao and his men hadn't appeared in time to help us, we'd both be dead now." Nadir Sharif's eyes darkened and he looked away for a moment. "I must tell you that shocks even me." He turned back and smiled. "But I'm pleased to see you're still very much alive." Hawksworth studied Nadir Sharif for a moment. "Do you have any idea who might have ordered it? This world of ours is fraught with evil, Ambassador." Nadir Sharif shook his head in resignation. "I sometimes marvel any of us survive it." Then he looked back at Hawksworth and beamed. "But then, I've always found you to be a man blessed with rare fortune, Ambassador. I think Allah must truly stand watch over you night and day. You seem to live on coincidences. I was always amazed. That just when His Majesty ordered you out of Agra, the Portuguese decided to seize one of His Majesty's personal cargo vessels, and by that imprudent folly restored you to favor. Now, I hear you were attacked in the Fatehpur camp? By some scurrilous hirelings at the very moment the prince's Rajputs just happened to be nearby to protect you. I only wish I enjoyed a small portion of your luck. He smiled. But what will you be doing now? Will you be joining with us, or will you stay with the prince? What do you mean? I understand His Highness is striking camp tomorrow and marching west for the Rajput city of Udaipur. The new Maharana there, a distinguished if somewhat renegade Rajput prin, named Karan Singh, apparently has offered his lake palace as a refuge for the prince. I don't seem to have much choice. I'm probably no more welcome in Agra right now than you are. Nadir Sharif examined him quizzically for a moment. I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean. Then he broke into laughter. Ambassador, surely you don't assume I had anything to do with the tragedy today. The honest truth is I used every means at my command to dissuade the Rajput cavalry from their insidious treachery. They absolutely refused to heed anything I said. In fact, I actually tried to forewarn Her Majesty something just like this might happen. What are you talking about? Their betrayal was astonishing. And I must tell you frankly, entirely unaccountable. I intend to prepare a complete report for Her Majesty, but this is merely a temporary setback for us, never fear. He turned and bowed lightly to Shirin, acknowledging her for the first time. I really must be leaving for the Imperial camp now. We've scheduled a war council tonight to plan our next strategy. He smiled. I feel I should counsel you once again that you've chosen very unsavory company. Prince Jadar is a thorough disgrace to the Empire. He bowed lightly once more to Hawksworth, then to Shirin, and turned to remount his elephant. Good night, Ambassador. Perhaps someday soon we'll drink sharbat together again in Agra. Even as he spoke, his elephant rose and began to move out. His last words were drowned by cheering Rajputs. He'll never get away with it. Hawksworth watched incredulously as the elephant began delicately picking its way through the shattered camp. Oh. As he will, you don't know Nadir Sharif as I do. Hawksworth turned to stare in bewilderment at Jadar. The prince was standing next to Mumtaz, their faces expressionless. As Nadir Sharif's elephant disappeared into the dark, Mumtaz said something in Persian and gestured toward Shirin. She replied in the same language and they moved together, embracing. Your face is still fresh as the dawn, though your coal is the dust of war. Mumtaz's Persian was delicate and laced with poetic allusions. She kissed Shirin, then looked down and noticed her right hand. And what happened to your thumb? I had no bow ring. You know we aren't supposed to shoot, or do anything else except bear sons. Mumtaz flashed a mock frown in a direction of Jadar. If I would let him, His Highness would treat me like some stupid Arab wet nurse instead of a Persian. She embraced Shirin again and kissed her once more. I also know you learned to fire a matchlock today. Ha! But did you find out? Some of the Rajputs saw you shoot a Bundela horseman who had breached their lines and reached His Highness' elephant. One of them told my eunuchs. Her voice dropped. He said you saved His Highness' life. I want to thank you. It was my duty. No, it was your love. I'm sorry I dare not tell His Highness what you did. He must never find out. He's already worried about too many obligations. You saw what just happened tonight with Father, I think. He's very troubled about what price he may be asked to pay someday for what happened today. I must tell you the English Feringhi also shot the Bundela who had mounted His Highness' elephant. Is he the one there? Mumtaz nodded discreetly toward Hawksworth, who stood uncomprehending, his haggard face and jerkin smeared with smoke. Her voice had risen slightly, and now her Persian was lilting again. He's the one. Mumtaz scrutinized Hawksworth with a quick flick of her eyes, never looking up. He's interesting, truly as striking as I'd heard. I love him more than my life. I wish you could know him. Shirin's Persian was equally as genteel as that of Mumtaz. "But is he yet a worthy lover in your bed, Taz's smile was almost hidden. "I sent your message to father about the Hindu Devadasi." Shirin smiled and said nothing. "Then you must bring him with us to Udaipur. If His Highness will have us there, we'll have you there." She laughed and looked again at Hawksworth. "If you'll tell me sometime what it's like to share your pillow with a Feringhi." "Captain Hawksworth." Jadar's martial voice rose above the assembled crowd of congratulating Rajputs. "Didn't I notice you on the field? Today, I thought I had assigned you to guard my Zenana. Are you aware the punishment for disobeying orders in an army in India is immediate beheading? If you like, I can have you shot from a cannon, as is sometimes done. Which would you prefer? Your cannon were mostly overrun. I guess you'll have to behead me if you can find anyone left with a sword sharp enough." Jadar roared and pulled out his own sword. There was a deep nick in the blade. "By tomorrow, I'm sure we can find one. In the meantime, I'll have to confine you in the Gulal bar to prevent your escape." He slipped the sword back into his belt. "Tell me, did you manage to hit anything today with your matchlocks?" "Possibly. There were so many. Imperial infantry, I may have succeeded in hitting someone." Jadar laughed again. "From the looks of her thumb, it would seem the woman in your howdah did most of the shooting. I'm astounded you'd permit her such liberty. She has a mind of her own." "Like all Persians." Jadar reached and lowered Mumtaz's veil over her face. She let it hang for a moment, then shoved it back again. "Allah protect us." He turned and stared a moment into the dark, toward the direction Nadir Shah if had departed. "Yes, Allah protect us from all Persians and from all Persian ambition." Then he suddenly remembered himself and glanced back at Hawksworth. "So tonight we may eat lamb together after all, if there's one still to be found? But not yet in paradise. For that you will have to wait a few days longer." Hawksworth shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly do you mean?" "Udaipur, Captain. Tomorrow we strike camp and march for Udaipur. It's a Rajput path." "Radice." He turned and beckoned toward the Rajput commander who had ridden from Fatehpur with them. "It's time you met my friend Madhu Singh, brother of His Highness, Rana Karan Singh, the Maharana of Udaipur. The Maharana has generously offered us his new guest palace on his island of Jagmandir. It's on Pakola Lake in the Rajput capital of Udaipur. He was only just building the palace when I was there before, but I seem to remember it's designed in a very interesting new style." He glanced at Mumtaz. "I think Her Highness will approve." Then he continued. "Rajputana, Captain, is beautiful. What's more, its mountains are impregnable. I led the only Moghul army ever to escape defeat by the Rajputs who live in those mountains. But today I have many loyal friends there." Madhu Singh bowed lightly to Hawksworth while Jadar watched in satisfaction. "His Highness, the Maharana, may decide to make a Rajput out you and keep you there if you seem worth the trouble. Who can tell?" He turned and dismissed Mumtaz and her eunuchs with a wave. He watched fondly as she disappeared into the Gulal bar, then turned and joined the waiting Rajputs. Together, they moved out through the camp, embracing and consoling. "Did you hear what he said?" Hawksworth turned to Shirin, who stood waiting, a light smile erasing some of the fatigue in her face. "He's planning to recruit another army of Rajputs. This war is only beginning. Good Christ, when will it end? When he's Moghul. Nothing will stop him now." She took his hand, and together they pushed through the shattered Gulal bar toward the remains of their tent. Book 5, Prince Jadar, Chapter 29. The advance of Prince Jadar's army west toward the Rajput stronghold of Udaipur was like nothing Brian Hawksworth had ever seen. Jadar was marching into the heart of ancient Rajput country, and the movement of his army suddenly came to resemble a triumphant victory procession. The heavy artillery formed the first contingent, drawn by teams of elephants and bullocks. 2,000 infantry moved in front, smoothing the ground with spades. The army's baggage animals followed the artillery, and after this came Jadar's personal treasury camels loaded with gold and silver coin together with his records and archives. Next in the line of march were elephants carrying the Zenana women's jewels, and a collection of ornate swords and daggers that Jadar periodically gave to his officers as presents. Then came the water camels, and finally Jadar's kitchen and provisions. The baggage was loaded by the ordinary cavalry, and after them rode Jadar and his retinue of nobles. Behind him came his zenana. The rear of the procession was brought up by women and servants, then elephants, camels, and mules carrying the remainder of the baggage and tents. Some of Jadar's zenana women traveled in gilded shawls carried on the shoulders of 4 bearers and shaded with netting of colored embroidered silk. Others were transported in enclosed palanquins, also covered with nets decorated with gold fringe and tassels. Still others chose to ride in swaying litters suspended between 2 elephants or 2 strong camels. A female slave walked near each litter carrying a peacock tail to brush off dust and eep away flies. Jadar's first and favorite wife, Mumtaz, seemed to scorn all these comforts, displaying herself regally all day long from atop her own personal elephant, riding in a gold howdah shaded by a vast tapestry umber. Her elephant was festooned with embroideries, yak tails, and large silver bells, and directly behind her, on 6 smaller elephants, rode the women of her immediate household. Her eunuchs rode clustered around her on horses, each carrying a wand signifying his office and sweating profusely beneath his jeweled turban. A vanguard of footmen with bamboo canes walked ahead of Mumtaz's elephant, clearing a path through the crowds. Jadar himself traveled mainly on his favorite Arabian horse, except when passing through cities, when he would switch to a conspicuously bedecked elephant surrounded by the high-ranking nobles. Trailing out behind this first circle were the ranks of the lesser mansabdars, who rode in full military dress, displaying swords, bows, shields. While this procession inched along at its regal pace, Jadar and his nobles frequently paused ostentatiously to bag tiger or chase stripe-eared antelope with the prince's brace of hunting cheetahs. A complete set of tents for Jadar and his zenana traveled a day ahead, to ensure that a fully prepared camp always awaited him and his women when, at approximately 3 in the afternoon, the procession would stop and begin to settle for the night. Each of his larger tents could be disassembled into 3 separate sections, and all of these together required a full 50 baggage elephants for transport. Moving the smaller tents required almost 100 camels. Wardrobes and kitchen utensils were carried by some 50 mules, and special porters carried by hand Jadar's personal porcelains, his gilt beds, and a few of his silk tents. The procession was a lavish display of all the wealth and arms Jadar had remaining, and nothing about it hinted that his was an army on the run, which in fact it was. Hawksworth puzzled over Jadar's extravagant pomp for several days, finding it uncharacteristic, and finally concluded it was a deliberate Indian strategy. Jadar has to raise another army, and quickly. He'll not do it if he has the look of a fugitive and loser about him. He's managed to hold the Imperial army at bay for a while, wound them enough to escape entrapment, but he's wounded too, and badly. The Imperial army may be shattered for the moment, but Jadar's lost half his own men. The winner will be the one who can rebuild first and attack, if Jadar doesn't make some alliances and get some men soon. Inayat Latif and the Queen will chase him from one end of India to the other. Along the way, a few independent Rajput chieftains had come to his banner, but not enough. When Hawksworth asked Shirin what she thought Jadar's chances were of raising a Rajput army large enough to face Inayat Latif, she had made no effort to conceal her concern. The greatest Rajput nobles are waiting to see whether Maharana Karan Singh of Udaipur will decide to openly support him. He's the leader of the Ranas of Muor, which is the name for the lands of Rajputana around Udaipur, and they're the highest in rank of all the Rajput chieftains of India. If Maharana Karan Singh agrees to support him with his own army, the other Ranas of Muor may follow, and after them perhaps all of Rajputana. What do you mean? He's providing Jadar a place to stay, or at least to hide while he licks his woo. That looks like support to me. Shirin had tried to smile. Permitting Prince Jadar to camp in Udaipur doesn't necessarily imply support. It could also be interpreted merely as traditional Rajput hospitality. It's one thing to open your guest house to a son of the Moghul. It's something quite different to commit your army to aid his rebellion. She drew her horse closer to Hawksworth's. You see, Maharana Karan Singh and his father Amar Singh before him have had a treaty of peace with Aurangzeb for almost 10 years, after many decades of bloody war between Muor and the Moghuls. There are many Rajput chieftains in Muor who do not want him to renounce that treaty. They're weary of Moghul armies invading Rajputana and burning their fields and cities. Prince Jadar will have to negotiate with Maharana Karan Singh if he's to be persuaded to help. The prince will have to offer him something in return for his aid. For the risk he'll be taking should the prince lose. That's why the other Rajputs are waiting. Everyone here knows the prince has no chance if the Maharana withholds his support. A noticeable feeling of relief swept through the long columns of Jadar's cavalry the afternoon that Maharana Karan Singh was sighted riding out on his elephant, surrounded by a retinue of his personal guard, to welcome Prince Jadar at the high stone gate leading through the walls of the mountain city of Udaipur. Throughout the ranks of Jadar's bedraggled army, it was seen as a positive omen. The army and the lesser Mansabdars camped outside the city walls. The highest-ranking nobles were invited to stay in the Maharana's city palace, set on a high cliff overlooking Picola Lake, and Jadar, his zenana, and his personal guards were ferried with much pomp across to the new guest palace on Jagmandir Island, in the center of the lake. As one of Aurangzeb's Khans and a foreign ambassador, Brian Hawksworth was installed by the Maharana in a special suite in his city palace reserved for dignitaries. In an even more auspicious gesture, the Maharana invited Prince Jadar to dine with him in the palace that evening. The ancient Rajputana tradition of hospitality did not normally require dining with your guests, and the Rajput chieftains traveling with Jadar were again heartened. Late in the afternoon, an invitation also arrived requesty. That Ambassador Hawksworth and Shirin, characterized as Jadar's personal aide, joined the dinner. Why do you think he wants us? When the Maharana's servants had left, Hawksworth showed the gilded invitation to Shirin. She was on their balcony watching white-necked cranes glide across the surface of Picola Lake, spreading out hundreds of feet below them. Perhaps the Maharana is curious to meet a Feringhi. I'm sure he's never seen one before. She hesitated. Or perhaps Prince Jadar arranged for you to be there, to imply he has the support of the English king's warships. You know I don't speak for King James on matters of war. Tonight you must appear to do so. I'm sure your king would help Prince Jadar if he knew him. He'll support him if he becomes Moghul. Then you must help Prince Jadar tonight, so that he will. Shirin had overseen the servants who had been sent to clean and repair Hawksworth's doublet and hose. Then a bath was brought, accompanied by barbers and manicurists. The Maharana sent a vial of musk perfume to Shirin, buried in a basket of flowers. By the time they were escorted through the high scalloped archway leading into the palace banquet hall, they both were bathed, perfumed, and refreshed, and Hawksworth again looked almost like an ambassador. Accustomed to the red sandstone of Agra, he was momentarily astounded to see a room fashioned entirely from purest white marble. The hall was long and wide, with 2 rows of bracketed columns its entire length. Maharana Karan Singh sat at the far end in front of a marble screen, his gold wand of office at his side, reclining against an enormous bolster of old brocade. He appeared to be Jadar's age, with eyes that sparkled mischievously, a long Rajput mustache, glistening with wax, which curled upward at the ends, and a turban of gold brocade. He wore a long red and white striped satin skirt beneath a translucent cloak. His necklace and earrings were matching green emeralds. Seated around him on red carpets woven with designs of fighting elephants were his Rajput nobles, each in white with an orange turban and a gold-trimmed brocade sash at his waist. Every Rajput in the room had a gold-handled katar, Jadar saw Hawksworth and Shirin enter and rose to greet them. The prince was dressed in his finest, with a cloak of gold cloth, pale green trousers, red velvet slippers, a long double string of pearls around his neck, and a pink silk turban crisscrossed with flowered brocade and secured with a large ruby. He led Hawksworth before the Maharana and introduced him in Rajasthani. Jadar then translated the introduction into Turkey for Hawksworth, who was startled to learn that he was a high-ranking member of Angrezi English royalty. He looked around and realized he was easily the most shabbily attired man in a room, including the servants. After the introduction, Hawksworth took his place among Jadar's own retinue of nobles. Shirin was seated on the carpet directly behind him. All the guests sat in a line facing a long, gold-threaded cloth. Spread along the floor, food was brought in on silver trays, which were placed on silver stools directly in front of each diner. Hawksworth had scarcely taken his seat before a full wine cup was placed in his hands. It was never allowed to approach dryness. The banquet was lavish, equaling anything he had seen in Agra. It was immediately apparent that roast game was the speciality of Udaipur, as tray after tray of antelope, venison, hare, and wild duck were placed before him. In its emphasis on roasted meats, the food could almost have been English, save it was all seasoned with spices he had never tasted in London. The centerpiece was an elaborately glazed wild boar the Maharana had bagged personally from horseback with a spear. Nominal Muslim though he was, Prince Jadar downed a generous portion of the boar and praised the flavor. The trays of meat were accompanied by spiced curds, local yogurts, and baked vegetables swimming in ghee. The meal concluded with dried fruits which had been sugared and perfumed, followed by mouth-freshening pan, the betel leaves wrapped around spiced bang, currants, sweet imported coconut. The final offering, eagerly awaited by all. The Rajputs was opium. As they popped down handfuls of the brown balls, Hawksworth discreetly signaled for more wine. After the dishes were cleared, several jeweled women in red trousers and thin, billowing blouses entered, drank glasses of wine in honor of the Maharana, then danced among the guests to the accompaniment of a large sarangi. After the dancers had been dismissed, Prince Jadar rose and proposed a toast to the Maharana. The toast was ceremonial, elaborate, and it seemed entirely expected by everyone. To His Highness, the Maharana of Udaipur, whose line flows directly from the great Kusa, son of Rama, king of Ajodhya and the noble hero of the Ramayana. Descendant of the royal house of the son, whose subjects will refuse their food if neither he nor his brother, the son, are present to show their face upon it and bless it. The Maharana's reply was equally effusive, describing Jadar as the greatest Moghul warrior in awe of history, the equal of his Mongol forebears Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, a worthy descendant of the early Moghul conquerors Babur and Humayun. And finally, the one Moghul whose martial skills might actually approach those of the fighting Rajputs of Muir, an oblique reference to the fact that Jadar had led the Moghul army that subdued Muir a decade earlier, and induced its Rajputs to finally acknowledge Moghul dominance over northwest India. Immoderate praise of one another's armies followed next. Then the Maharana said something else, and Jadar turned suddenly toward Hawksworth. Ambassador Hawksworth, His Highness has asked to speak with you. Hawksworth rose from the carpet and moved forward. Around him, the Udaipur Rajputs studied him with open curiosity. They had listened to lavish toasts for years, but none had ever before seen a Feringhi in a doublet. The very concept of such a phenomenon exceeded their imagination. His Highness has asked permission to allow his court painters to make your portrait, so that he may remember your likeness. Dressed as you are tonight, do you have any objection? Please tell His Highness I would be honored. Hawksworth found himself startled and unsure what reply was appropriate. Please tell him that my own father was once a painter in England. Jadar smiled through his teeth. You mean I should tell him there are, of course, many skilled artists in your Noba land of England? Your own father, as we both know, was a great Khan in England, not a lowly craftsman." As Hawksworth nodded dully, Jadar turned and translated this to the Maharana. Karan Singh's eyes brightened as he replied to Jadar. He asks if your king's painters are expert in Ragamala. I'm not entirely sure what His Highness refers to. Hawksworth examined Jadar with a puzzled expression. Jadar translated, and the Rajput looked surprised. He turned and quickly said something to one of the servants, who vanished and reappeared moments later with a leather-bound folio. The Maharana spoke briefly to Jadar, then passed the book. The Maharana politely suggests that possibly your English kings' painters have not yet achieved the sophistication required for Ragamala. He asks me to show you one of his personal albums. Jadar opened the book and handed it to Hawksworth. It was filled with vibrant miniature paintings, executed on heavy sheets of paper that had been treated with a white pigment of rice water and lavishly embellished with gold leaf. They showed round-eyed young women with firm breasts and slender wrists lounging in beautifully stylized gardens and courtyards, playing gilded instruments or sensuously embracing their lovers, many surrounded by doves, peacocks, tame deer, and tapestry-covered elephants. In some, the blue-faced god Krishna played an instrument that looked something like a sitar to the wistful gaze of longing doe-eyed women whose breasts swelled through their gauze wraps. The paintings imparted to Hawksworth a curious world of emotional intensity, a celebration of life, love, and devotion. Each Ragamala painting depicts the mood of a specific raga. Jadar pointed to one of a jeweled woman feeding a peacock which leaned down from a white marble rooftop, while her lover reached his arms to encircle her. This is a raga named Hindal, Amor, earning raga of love. The Ragamala paintings of Muir are a perfect blend of music, poetry, and pure art. Jadar winked. After the Maharana has painted you in your native costume, perhaps he will have his artists paint you as the young god Krishna, enticing some milkmaids to your leafy bed. The Maharana spoke again to Jadar. He asks whether these are anything like the paintings your king's artists create for English ragas. Tell him we don't have ragas. In England, our music is different. Jadar tried to mask his discomfort. Perhaps I should merely say your English ragas are in a different style from those we have in India. He will not be impressed to learn that English music is not yet advanced enough to have developed the raga. Jadar's reply seemed to satisfy the Maharana. He turned and said something to one of the men sitting near him. His Highness has ordered that you be given an album of Ragamala paintings to take it back to your king, so the painters at his court may try to copy them and begin to learn greatness. His Majesty, King James, will be deeply honored by the Rana's gift. Hawksworth bowed diplomatically, deciding not to inform the Maharana that King James had no painters and little taste. The Maharana beamed in satisfaction and dismissed Hawksworth with a nod. Then the exchange of gifts began. Jadar produced a gold cloak for the Maharana, a jewel-encrusted ord, a jeweled saddle, and promised to deliver an elephant with a silver howdah. The Maharana in turn gave Jadar an emerald the size of a large walnut, a gilded shield studded with jewels, and a brace of jeweled katars. Each thanked the other extravagantly and set the presents aside. Then Jadar suddenly stood up and began removing his turban. The room fell silent at this unprecedented act. Tonight, in gratitude for his friendship, for his offer of an abode to one who no longer has any roof save a tent, I offer to His Highness, the Maharana of Udaipur, my own turban, that he may have a lasting token of my gratitude. That in the years ahead when, Allah willing, these dark days are past, we will neither of us forget my indebtedness on this night. As Jadar stepped forward to present the turban, the Maharana's eyes flooded with emotion. Before Jadar had moved more than a pace, Karan Singh was on his feet, ripping off his turban. They met in the center of the room, each reverently placing his own turban on the other's head, then embracing. Hawksworth looked around the room and saw Rajputs who would gut an enemy without a blink now near to tears. He leaned back toward Shirin. What's the significance of the turbans? It's the rarest gift any man could present to another. I've never before heard of a Moghul or a Rajput giving his turban. The story of this will be told throughout Muir. We have seen the creation of a legend. Then the Maharana's voice rose. Muir, the abode of all that is beautiful in the world, is made even more beautiful by your presence. In years past we have stood shield to shield with you. Tonight we embrace you in friendship. We wish you victory over those who would deny you your birthright, which you have earned both by blood and by deed. No other in India is more fit to reign, more just to govern, more honorable to his friends, more revered by his foes. Tonight we offer you our hand and our prayers that Lord Krishna will always stand with you. Hawksworth turned to Shirin and whispered, "What's he saying?" Her eyes were dark. "He's delaying his answer to the prince, offering him prayers to Lord Krishna. Prince Jadar doesn't need prayers to Krishna, he needs Rajputs, thousands of Rajputs. But perhaps in time the Maharana can be convinced. Banquets are not the place for negotiation. They're the place for perfumed talk." Jadar was smiling as though he had just been offered the whole of Rajputana. He managed to thank the Maharana lavishly. The Maharana beamed and signaled for pan leaves again, signifying the evening was ended. The room emptied in moments. I think Jadar could be in serious trouble. Hawksworth turned to Shirin as they entered the hallway. If he fails to get support here, what will he do? I don't know. I think he may still manage an alliance, Biff. Or he's through, but it will be costly. Otherwise, he'll probably have to move south and try to convince Malik Ambar to commit him his Maratha army. But Rajputs are better. She moved closer. I'm suddenly so very, very tired of Hermes' intents and strategies. I don't know where it will end. Time is running out, for him and for us. She brushed him lightly with her body. Will you make love to me tonight as though we'd never heard of Rajputs and Marathas? We'll look at the lake in the moonlight and forget everything, just for tonight. She opened her hand. Inside were several small brown balls. I took some of the Maharana's Afian. Tonight we have no battles to fight. Hawksworth sat beside Shirin, watching the oarsmen strain against the locks, their orange oars flashing against the ornately gilded boat like the immense gills of some ceremonial fish. A turbaned drummer sat at one end, sounding the beat, and the tillerman stood behind him. They were headed for Jagmandir Island, on the invitation of Prince Jadar, in a boat provided by Maharana Karan Singh. 3 weeks of banquets, hunting, and oaths of lasting friendship seemed to have done little to resolve the question of the Maharana's support for Jadar's rebellion. Time, Hawksworth told himself, is starting to work heavily against the prince. The Imperial Army let us escape because they were too to attack again. But we all know they're rebuilding. Jadar has to decide soon how much longer he can afford to stay here and listen to vague promises. Behind them, the high walls and turrets of the Maharana's palace towered above the cliff, reflecting gold in the late afternoon sun. As they neared the island, Hawksworth turned back to see the thick stone walls of the city following the curve of the surrounding hilltops, and finally angling down to a tall watchtower at the very edge of the lake. He realized the lake itself was actually the city's fourth defense barrier. Ahead, the white sandstone palace on Jagmandir glistened against the water. At the front, a large pavilion surrounded by delicate white pillars jutted out into the lake. Its entrance was guarded by a row of life-sized stone elephants rising out of the water, their trunks raised above their heads in silent salute. As their boat neared the arched entryway of the pavilion, Hawksworth saw a veiled woman surrounded by eunuchs standing on the marble-paved dock to greet them. It's Her Highness Princess Mumtaz. Shirin's voice was suddenly flooded with surprised delight. Then she turned to Hawksworth with a laugh. Welcome to the Zenana, Ambassador. What's she doing here? Hawksworth examined the figure, whose jewels glistened in the afternoon sun, then warily studied the eunuchs. She's come to meet us. Shirin's voice was lilting in anticipation. I think she's bored to frustration, trapped on this island prison. As their boat touched the dock, Mumtaz moved forward and immediately embraced Shirin. Her eyes swept Hawksworth as he bowed. Your Highness. Mumtaz giggled behind her veil and turned to Shirin, speaking in Persian. Do we have to speak barbarous Turkey because of him? Just for this afternoon. I welcome you in the name of His Highness. Mumtaz's Turkey was accented but otherwise flawless. He asked me to meet you and show you the garden and a palace. She began chattering to Shirin in a mixture of Persian and Turkey as they walked into the garden. It soon revealed itself to be a matrix of bubbling fountains and geometrical stone walkways, beside which rows of brightly colored flowers bloomed. Ahead of them, the small three-story palace rose skyward like a long-stemmed lotus, its top a high dome with a sensuous curve. The ground floor was an open arcade, with light interior columns and a row of connecting orders off each side for women and servants, screened behind marble grillwork. Mumtaz directed them on through the garden and into the cool arcade of the palace. At one side, near the back, a stone stairway spiraled upward to the second floor. Mumtaz led the way, motioning them to follow. At the second floor, they emerged into a small chamber strewn with bolsters and carpets that seemed to be Jadar's reception room. Mumtaz ignored it as she started up the next killer staircase. The topmost room was tiny, dazzling white, completely unfurnished. The ornate marble cupola of the dome towered some 30 feet above their heads, and around the sides were carved niches decorated with colored stone. Beamed through the room from a wide doorway leading to a balcony, which was also bare save for an ornately carved sitter leaned against its railing. His Highness has taken a particular fondness for this room, and refuses to allow anything to be placed in it. He sits here for hours and on the balcony there, doing I don't know what. Mumtaz gestured toward the doorway. He wanted me to bring you here to wait for him. She sighed. I agree with him that this room brings a great feeling of peace, but what good is peace that cannot last? I don't know how much longer we can stay here. Mumtaz turned and hugged Shirin again. I so miss Agra and the Jamuna. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever see it again. Shirin stroked Mumtaz's dark hair, then said something to her in Persian. Mumtaz smiled and turned to Hawksworth. You really love her, more than anything. Hawksworth was momentarily startled by her directness. Then take her with you. Away from here, away from all the killing and death. How much longer can any of us endure it? Her hard eyes blinked away a hint of a tear. I've lived most of my life with His Highness in tents, bearing children. I'm so weary of it all. Now I wonder if we'll ever have a place just for ourselves. She would have continued, but footsteps sounded on the stone stairs, and Jadar emerged beaming from the stairwell, his turban set rakishly on the side of his head. He seemed in spirits. You're here? Let me welcome you and offer you something to banish the afternoon heat. He gave Mumtaz a quick hug. Hawksworth sensed this was not the official Jadar. This was a prince very much at his ease. I hope Shirin will jaw in me in having some sharbat. But for you, Captain, I've had a surprise prepared. I think you might even like it better than your foul brandy. He spoke quickly to a eunuch waiting at the top of the stairs, then turned back to Hawksworth and, Shirin, have you found the Maharana's palace to your liking? His view of the lake and the mountains is the finest in India. Shirin performed a teslim. We so thank your Highness. Mumtaz embraced Shirin once more, said something to her in Persian, then bowed to Jadar and disappeared down the stairwell. He watched her tenderly until she was gone before he turned back to Hawksworth and Shirin. Come outside with me. He walked past them through the marble doorway. Have you seen the lake yet from the balcony? This one afternoon we will drink together and watch the sunset. Before we all leave Udaipur, I wanted you to see this place. It's become very special for me. When I sit here in the cool afternoon, I seem to forget all the wounds I've ever felt in battle. For a moment, nothing else exists. I think this palace is almost finer than the one Rana Karan Singh has. Hawksworth stroked Shirin's thigh as they followed Jadar onto the cool balcony, impulsively wanting her in his arms. Then he cleared his throat. I don't remember ever seeing anything quite like it in India. At times you can be a perceptive man, Captain. Allah may have showed his wisdom when he sent you here. Jadar smiled. You know, I still remember my first word of your arrival, and your now famous encounter with the Portuguese. I think that morning will someday change the history of both our lands, the morning India and England met. He looked pensively down into the garden below. It all depends on what happens next. What do you think will happen, Highness? Shirin moved next to Jadar at the edge of the balcony. He squinted into the waning sun for a moment, then turned his eyes away. It's difficult to know. Probably the Imperial Army will be sent against me again any day now. Will the Maharana support you with his cavalry? Jadar fell silent, as though choosing his words carefully. Then he shrugged a discretion. I think he might, but I still don't know. I hear that many of the other Ranas of Rajputana have warned him not to side with me openly. They still remember the devastation Inayat Latif wrought here 15 years ago. When he was sent by Arangbar to put down their rebellion. Rajputs love to battle, but not amid their own cities and fields, and that's easy to understand. Rana Karan Singh is in a difficult position. He knows if I stand here and fight, the battle could well destroy Udaipur. What will you do? I'll probably have to move out soon and move quickly, farther north into the mountains or back south to Burhanpur. I can't stand and fight again, not yet. That's one of the reasons I sent for you. He turned to face Hawksworth. I think it's time you left India. No one in Agra except Nadir Sharif knows you're alive, but it's obvious you can't return there, not under the present circumstances. It's probably best that you return to England, at least until my fortunes are resolved. You must not join me in any more battles. It's not your war. Hawksworth felt a sudden chill against his skin. There's no reason for me to leave. And besides, I have no way to return to England now. The company is supposed to send a voyage this autumn, but there's always a way to do anything, Captain. Jadar stopped and laughed. Well, almost anything, here at Uday. Or you're only a few days' ride south to our port of Cambay. Like Surat, it's still free of Portuguese control. I may have very few friends left in Agra, but I do have friends in Cambay. I can arrange for your passage on an Indian trader as far as the Moluccas, where you can doubtless hail a Dutch fleet. You can leave India secretly and safely. No one in Agra need ever know you helped me. I am not sure I want to leave now. Hawksworth slipped his arm around Shirin's waist. Jadar looked at him and smiled. But Shirin has to leave with you. Her life is no safer here now than yours. He fixed them both squarely. I hereby command her to accompany you. You can both return to India. Someday if Allah is kind and I succeed. And you'll be first among all my ambassadors, Captain, I promise you. You'll receive my first firman for trade. But if I die in the days to come, your English king will not be accused someday of aiding a renegade. I hereby order you both to leave tomorrow. I don't run from a fight. There's some sea dog left in me. I know you don't, Captain, and that's one of the things I like most about you. But I'm sending you away, ordering you to go. I'll always remember it was against your will. Jadar looked up to see a eunuch entering with a tray of cups. Now for your drink. I ordered my kitchen to make punch for you. I understand the Tapuwalas in Surat. Think it's called punch? Punch, what is it? An Indian delicacy. A special blend of wine, water, sugar, lemons, and spices. 5 ingredients. Actually, panch is just the Hindi word for 5. Try it. Hawksworth tasted the perfumed red mixture, slices of lemon rind floating on its surface. It was so delicious he almost drank it off at one gulp. Jadar watched him, smiling, then lifted a cup of sharbat from the tray and gestured the eunuch towards Shirin. I gather you find it acceptable. It's perfect to watch a sunset with. I thought you'd like it. You know, Captain, I've rather enjoyed seeing you grow to understand and love India. That's rare among Feringhi. That's why I absolutely insist your king send you back as his next ambassador. Nothing would please me more. I think you mean it. And I want you to believe me when I tell you that nothing would please me more. Together we'll rid India of the Portuguese scourge forever. Jadar lifted his cap in a toast and Hawksworth joined him. And here's to ridding India of one Portuguese in particular. Jadar paused. Who do you mean? The Viceroy, Miguel Vajantes. I don't think I ever told you him. Murdered my father in Goa many years ago. Jadar listened in silence. I had no idea. Then his eyes grew grim. I know him all too well. You may or may not be aware he was once planning to arm Malik Ambar against me. Unfortunately, there's very little I can do about him just now. But I have a long memory too, and someday, Allah willing, I'll put an end to his trade. Will that be justice enough for us both? I'll drink to it. And I'll drink with you. Jadar took a deep swallow of sharbat. To England and India. And now, for the other reason I asked you both here today, to see what you think about something. It's curious, but living here in this little palace, I've found myself growing. Obsessed by an idea. I'd like to know if you think it's mad. He drank again, then signaled the waiting eunuch to refill their cups. If I become Moghul one day, I've decided to build something very special for Mumtaz, a work of beauty like anything India has ever seen. Staying here on Jagmandir Island has given me the idea, but first come inside and let me show you something. Jadar rose and strolled back through the columned doorway into the domed room. I happened to notice this when you came in. He pointed to one of the 2-foot-high niches in the curved walls. Hawksworth realized that each niche was decorated around its top and sides with inlays of semi-precious stones set into the marble. Each inlay was a painting of a different flower. Do you see what he's done here? Jadar motioned Hawksworth and Shirin closer. This is far more than merely a design. It's actually a painting in rare, colored stone onyx, carnelian. Jasper, agate? Jadar paused. Think carefully. Have either of you ever seen anything like this in Agra? I've never seen anything like it before anywhere. Of course you haven't. This is unique. It's truly astonishing, here on Jagmand. Your island, with the design of this room, Rana Karan Singh has actually invented a new style of art. It's phenomenal. Now look up. Jadar pointed to the cupola ceiling. Notice the sensuous curve of the dome, like a bud just before, or it bursts into flower, and at the top you see more inlays of precious stone. I think it's the most magnificent thing I've ever seen. Its shape and color and purity move me almost to tears. He paused and looked at Hawksworth mist. Shivasli? So can you guess what I've decided to do someday? Build a room like this in Agra. Jadar exploded with laughter. But this room is so small. What sort of gift would that be for Mumtaz? No, Captain, if I should eventually find myself ruling India, I've decided to build Mumtaz an entire palace like this, a mahal, all of white marble and inlay. I'll surround it with a garden larger and more beautiful than anything India has ever seen. It will be a place of love and of mystery, with the strength of a Rajput warrior in the harsh sunshine, the warmth of a Persian woman in the moonlight. The outside will be covered with verses from the Quran carved in marble, and inside the walls will be a garden of jeweled flowers. Minarets will rise at each corner, calling all India to prayer, and its dome will be a cupola with the subtle, sensuous curve of a ripening bud. It will be immense, the most magnificent mahal in the world, and it will be my gift to her. He paused, his eyes glowing. Is the idea completely insane? It's beautiful. Shirin was beaming. I think it's magnificent. Jadar seemed not to need encouragement as he drank again from his sharbat. So now, you know the other reason I invited you here this afternoon. To tell you what you may see when you return to Agra. I haven't decided on the exact location yet, but it will be on the bank of the Jamuna, placed so Mumtaz can watch this unset over the water, just as we do here. I wanted to tell you both, for I sense you two are among the few who could really appreciate what a bold idea this is. Jadar looked sharply at Shirin. Now, you must never tell Mumtaz whatever else you two Persians may chatter on about. For now, let's keep it a secret among us. But someday it will tell all the world how much I love her. He sighed. You know, at times I worry I'm nothing more than a romantic Persian myself, deep inside. He looked about the glistening walls once more, then reluctantly turned and walked out onto the balcony again. The peace I feel here overwhelms me sometimes. It quiets all the unrest in my soul. Perhaps I'm a fool to ever think of Agra, but Agra is my destiny. The Hindus would say it's my dharma. He stopped to watch as Mumtaz and her women emerged from their quarters and gathered around the fountain in the garden below. The Evening air was flooded with the women's rose attar and musk perfume. He inhaled deeply, then turned to Hawksworth. "By the way, I've had a small farewell gift made for you, Captain. It's there beside you." He pointed to the sitar by the railing. "I understand you've started learning to play it." Hawksworth turned, startled, and picked up the instrument. Its workmanship was fine art, with ivory inlays along both sides of the body and a neck carved as the head of a swan. He found himself stunned. "I've only just begun to learn, Highness. This is much finer than I deserve. It's worthy of an Ustad. Then perhaps it will inspire you to become a master yourself someday," he laughed. "And now I want to hear how you play it." The Hindus believe the sitar is a window to the soul, that the sound of the first note tells everything there is to know about a man. I want to see if you've actually understood anything since you've been here. What raga have you been studying? Alcons, an ambitious choice. I seem to remember that's a devotional raga for late evening. But the sun's almost down. We'll pretend it's the moon just rising. Let's go inside where you can sit. Hawksworth carried the sitar and follow, numbly as Jadar led the way back into the tiny marble room. The apprehension he had momentarily felt on the balcony seemed to dissolve among the bouquets of precious stones in the inlaid walls. He slipped off his shoes and seated himself in the middle of the room. Then he quickly tested the tuning on the strings, both the upper and the lower. He could already tell the sound it produced was magnificent, with the resonance of an organ. Jadar and Shirin seated themselves opposite, speaking Persian in low voices as they watched him cradle the round body of the sitar in the curved instep of his left foot. Then they both fell expectantly silent. He knew what they were waiting to hear. For the raga Malkauns, a master would sound the first note powerfully, yet with a sense of great subtlety, slipping his finger quickly down the string and into the note just as it was struck, then instantly pulling the string across the fret, almost in the same motion, again raising the itch and giving the feeling the note had merely been tasted, dipped down into and out again as it quavered into existence. But it was much more than mere technique. That was the easiest part. It was a sense, a feeling. It came not from the hand, but from the heart. The note must be felt, not merely sounded. When done with lightness, life seemed to be created, a prana in the music that the player and listener shared as one. But if the player's heart was false, regardless of how skilled he might be, then his music was hollow and dead. He breathed deeply, trying to clear his mind, then slipped the wire plectrum over his finger and gently stroked the lower sympathetic strings twice to establish the mood. The air was crisp and flower-scented, and the sound rose gently upward toward the marble cupola above them. As he listened, he found himself looking at Shirin and Jadar, their dark eyes, delicate faces. Then his eyes moved beyond to the garden of inlaid stones in the marble walls, and for a moment he felt something he had never felt before. This was the India he had, until that moment, only been in, but here now he was finally part of it. He took an other deep breath and struck. The first note was perfect, encompassing. He felt it. He knew it. He sensed his hand merge with the music with his own life. Shirin's eyes seemed to melt, and Jadar immediately swung his head from I to side in approval. Then he began to elap the virtuoso first section of the raga, meant to be played solo and without drum accompaniment. He felt the music slowly growing around him as he found and explored note after note of the raga's structure. He found himself wanting to taste and feel each note to its essence, reluctant to move on to the next. But each time he was beckoned forward, until at last nothing but the music mattered. He played on, and on, the intensity of the elap growing organically, almost of its own self, until it burst to completion, like a flower that had gloriously escaped the entrapment of its bud. When the final note died into silence, Shirin slowly rose and slipped her arms around his neck. Jadar sat motionless for a moment longer, then reached out and put his hand on the strings of the sitar. "You have earned it, Captain. I've heard what I'd hoped to hear. Your music tells me all I want to know about you." He rose and led them back out onto the balcony. "I know now you can understand why I also want to create something of beauty someday. a mahal that will last as long as this music, if we cannot taste love it. Beauty, our hearts are dead, he smiled at Hawksworth. There is love in your music, Captain. Your heart is as it should be, and in the end, nothing else really matters, nothing else. He turned and stared pensively into the twilight. My mahal will have it too, because it is in my own heart. Jadar stopped abruptly and gazed toward the darkening shore. Through the dimming light, a boat could be seen approaching, rowed furiously by lines of red-cloaked oarsmen, sitting in the center on. A gilded platform was Maharana Karan Singh, wearing full battle dress. His powerful bow hung loosely from his leather quiver, and his rhino-hide shield rested at his side. Jadar studied the boat for a moment, and concern gathered in his eye. He would never come here unannounced. Merciful Allah, has the Imperial Army moved against us already? How can it be so soon? My preparations have scarcely begun. Jadar watched as the Maharana leaped from the boat almost before it. Touched the marble dock. The women around Mumtaz fled the courtyard, and now the eunuchs pressed forward to bow and welcome him. He brushed them aside as he moved quickly through the garden and into the lower arcade of the palace. Jadar stood listening expectantly to the quick pad of his footsteps on the stone stairs, then walked inside to greet him. Nimast, my friend, you've already missed the best part of the sunset, but I'll have more sharbat sent. The Maharana glanced in. Surprise at Hawksworth and Shirin for a second, then turned and bowed quickly to Jadar. The news is very bad, Highness. Then we'll sweeten it with sharbat. There is no time, Highness. There's always time for sharbat. This has been a special afternoon for me. Highness, I came to tell you Arangbar is dead. The Moghul of India joined the Immortals 2 days ago. Jadar examined him a moment, almost as though not comprehending. Then he turned and stared out through the balcony doorway past Hawksworth and Shirin. I would not have wished it. I sincerely would not have wished it. He turned back to Karan Singh. How did he die? Did Janahara murder my father as she's killed so many others? No, Highness, it almost seems as though he deemed it his time to die. 2 weeks ago he was hunting and saw a beater stumble and fall over a ledge, killing himself. His Majesty grew despondent, saying he had caused the man's death. Next he began to declare it an omen of his own death. He refused food and drink. Finally, even the physicians despaired. He died in his bed. Word was given out that he was still hunting, so the news was carefully kept from all of Agra until the very end. How did you learn? Nadir Sharif sent runners. He dared not send a pigeon. Jadar walked out onto the balcony and peered down into the darkened garden. After a long moment he spoke. Allah, then it's finished. He turned back to the Rajput. Has Janahara declared Aladdin Moghul yet? She has announced she will do so, Highness. Karan Singh moved out onto the balcony next to Jadar, hesitant to interrupt his thoughts. The cries of water birds uttered the evening air around them. Jadar studied the garden again, as though lost in some distant reverie. When he spoke, his voice seemed to emanate from a bottomless void. Aladdin will be in the Red Fort. It can never be taken, not even with 100,000 Rajputs. He will never come to face me. He will never need to. He turned slowly to Karan Singh. I've lost it all, my friend, and I've brought ignominy to your lands by my presence as your guest. For that, I am truly sorry. Karan Singh stared at Jadar. But Highness, Aladdin may not yet be in Agra. You know he wanted Queen Janahara to appoint him to command the army sent against you. Naturally, she refused and instead convinced Arangbar to appoint him commander of the forces to be sent against the Persian Safavids threatening the northwest fortress of Kandahar. It was obvious to everyone, except Aladdin, that she meant it to be merely a ceremonial appointment, an excuse to elevate his mansab rank to equal yours. She had carefully arranged to have him detained in Agra, but he decided on his own that he would actually go north to prove himself a commander. Just before the hunting accident, he persuaded Arangbar to allow him to march. Arangbar was apparently drunk on wine and approved the order before Janahara discovered it. Aladdin departed Agra a week ago with 20,000 men and a huge train of courtiers. Because of their numbers, it's thought he has traveled very slowly. But Nadir Sharif said as of the day before yesterday he still had not returned to Agra. No one knows for sure how near he may actually be. And where are Anai? At Latif and the Imperial Army, Jadar's voice quickened. Of that we're not yet certain, Highness. They may be in Agra by now, holding the Red Fort for Aladdin, but we have no way to know. Jadar turned and seized his arm. Then, I will ride. Tonight, have you told my men? 2,000 of my men are now in their saddles waiting, Highness. By sunup, another 20,000 will be ready to ride. Jadar stared at him for a moment, then reached out and touched the turban the Rajput was wearing. Hawksworth realized it was Jadar's gift. Then give me 3 of your best horses. Tonight, I will rotate as I ride. Jadar turned and ordered a waiting eunuch to bring his riding cloak, his sword, and his qatar. I will be riding with you too, Highness. Karan Singh stepped forward. This time Jadar embraced Karan Singh for a long moment. Then he pulled back. No, I will not allow it. If I am too late and the odds are strong against me. And no one who rides with me will leave Agra alive. No, my friend, this I forbid. Jadar silenced Karan Singh's gesture of protest. Your offer is enough. I want my good friends alive. Jadar started for the stairs, then paused and turned back to look one last time at Hawksworth and Shirin. So our farewell was more timely than we knew. I regret we did not have longer. He paused to take his riding cloak from the eunuch. Then he reached for Hawksworth's hand. Remember me, my friend, and remember the Mahal. I've told no one else. If I'm still alive when you come again to Agra, I'll take you there. If I'm dead, remember what I dreamed. He turned and disappeared down the stairwell. A tear stained Shirin's cheek as she watched him move across the courtyard below. When he reached Mumtaz, anxiously waiting by the dock, he paused and said something to her, then embraced her closely. As he pulled away, she reached out to stop him. But he was already joining the Maharana in the boat. In moments, they were swallowed in the dusk. None of us will ever see him again. You know it's true? Shirin's voice was strangely quiet. What does it matter where Aladdin is? Prince Jadar can never chat. Linge, the troops Janahara will have holding the Red Fort. Not with 2,000 Rajputs, not with 200,000 Rajputs. It's impregnable. He'll never see the inside of the Red Fort again. She moved next to him and rested her head against his chest. Will you help me remember him from tonight, and the Mahal he will never live to build? I'll remember it all. He encircled her in his arms, wanting her warmth, and together they watched the last shafts of die in the dark waters below. London. Sir Randolph Spencer studied the leather-bound packet for a long moment, turning it apprehensively in his hand. Then he meticulously untied the wrapping and smoothed the weathered parchment against the top of his desk. Around the timbered room, the company's secretaries waited nervously, in prim wigs and doublets, watching as he quickly scanned the contents. Then he looked up, beamed, and with a loud voice began to read. Java, Port of Bantam, the 3rd of May, George Elkington, Chief Merchant, to the Right Honorable Sir Randolph Spencer, Director of the Worshipful Company of the East India Merchants in London, Honourable. Sir, my duty premised, etc., and expecting your worship's favourable perusing of this letter. May it please God, the discovery will be fully laded within the month and ready to sail. In the meanwhile, I forward this letter by Capt. Otter, Inc. of the Spiegel, bound this day for Amsterdam, to advise you of certain new conditions affecting the company's trade. I have informed you by earlier letter of our entertainment, provided the Portugals in the Surat Bay, with the 2 of their vessels set to fire, by which they were all consumed, and between 400 and 500 men slain, burnt, and drowned, and of ours, God be praised, only 2 and some few hurt, with all commodity safe. I have reported also the loss of the Resolve at Surat, by lamentable circumstance. Yet I maintain great hope that we are like to discover profitable trade with the country of India. I write now to advise you the Hollanders have late brought news of a new king of a country. Reports have reached the Moluccas that the Moghul Erangbar died suddenly some 2 months past, to be succeeded by one of his sons, whose pleasure toward England is uncertain. The full events are not clearly known here, but this will doubtless require our new petition for license to trade. As is oft the way in heathen lands, the story of the son's succession is a marvelous convoluted tale. There were said to be two sons in contention, belike both knaves and the Hollanders have deduced that the late Erengbar's queen, named Janahara, favored one son over the other, for reasons known best to herself, and intrigued in his succession. They have concluded thus because the new Moghul is said to have simply rewarded her with a large, secluded estate of her own outside of Agra, with his personal guards to protect her, something the Dutchmen claim has never before been done for a Moorish queen in India. The Hollanders further deduce that the queen effected the favored son's succession through her prime minister, a subtle rogue called Sharif, who, when the Moghul Erengbar died, secretly arranged the assassination of the other son before he could reach Agra and make his own clay. For the throne, this said Sharif was again appointed prime minister by the new Moghul, doubtless a reward for his cunning service. So it is His Majesty King James may now desire to dispatch another ambassador to Agra to petition this new Moghul to grant English trade. If a petition is to be sent, know that before taking the throne, this son was called by the name Prince Jadar, though doubtless he is now to be addressed formally as the Moghul, have as yet been unable to discover whether the mission of Capt. Hawksworth to Agra, authorized by your worship in your wisdom, met success. Though his mission will no longer assist the company in any instance, since he would not be known to this new Moghul Jadar. However, the Hollanders have advised that an English seaman named Hawksworth was taken from an Indian vessel off Malabar 1 month past in company with a Moorish woman, by a frigate of theirs that later was caught by a storm off the same Malabar coast. Her mainmast split in that storm, and the vessel was lost sight of soon after, leaving the Hollanders to lament it may have sunk or gone aground on the coast, together with over 500 ton of their Malabar pepper. If this was our former Captain General, he is either gone to God or is now again in India. If the vessel haply made landfall and saved the Hollanders' pepper. In closing, for the Dutchmen advise they are preparing to hoist sail, I am content to report that Indian commodity is readily vendible at the port of Bantam, particularly fine calicos and indigo, and I adjudge the company would be well advised to dispatch a new voyage to Surat upon receipt of this letter. The monopoly of the Portugals holds no more after their humiliation in the late engagement off Surat, on condition the company post a gentleman of quality to Agra, one less susceptible to Moorish ways than Capt. Hawksworth, and therefore, in my judgment, like to be better respected by the new Moghul. Our subscribers stand to enjoy great profit in the company's Indies trade, so desiring God to add a blessing to all endeavors tending to this business of ours, and of all that may succeed us to God's glory and the company's benefit, your worship's faithful servant Geo. Elkington ***** afterward for those curious how much of the foregoing tale is true. Perhaps it may be helpful to unmask the original inspiration for several of the characters. The great Moghul Akman, his son Erengbar, and Erengbar's primary consort, Queen Janahara, had real-life counterparts in the great Moghul Akbar, his successor Jahangir, and Jahangir's resourceful Persian queen, Nur Jahan. Nadir Sharif, for all his duplicity, had nothing on Jahangir's devious prime minister, Asaf Khan, the brother of Queen Nur Jahan. Similarly, Prince Jadar was no more ingenious and no less wronged than Asaf Khan's son-in-law, the subsequent Moghul and builder of the Taj Mahal, Shah Jahan. Prince Jadar's strategies and intrigues, first with and then against Queen Janahara, resemble in many ways those of Shah Jahan as he struggled to thwart the ambitions of Nur Jahan. The Shahbandar and the opium-sotted governor of Surat also had counterparts in real individuals, as did Jadar's beloved Mumtaz, his younger brother, or Prince Aladdin, Princess Layla, Malik Ambar, and Inayat Latif. The Sufi mystic Samad was recreated from the real-life poet Sarmad, who was admired by Shah Jahan, and who was executed by a later Moghul for precisely the reasons given in the story. Of the Portuguese, Father Alvarez Sarmento was drawn in some part from the learned Father Jerome Xavier. It should be noted that the unofficial actions of the early Jesuits in India are remembered today, primarily through the perceptions of English travelers, all of whom were staunchly anti-Catholic. The role of Portuguese Jesuits in the preceding story was faithful in spirit to the English reports, although today these may seem mild. Paranoid in their fear and suspicion of the English characters, only Huygens and Roger Sims are beholden to single, recognizable individuals, being Jan van Linschoten and Ralph Fitch, respectively. Brian Hawksworth is largely a fictional composite, whose experiences recall in part those of William Hawkins in India from 1608 to 1613, and in part those of other 17th-century European adventurers. His defeat of the four Portuguese galleons was only a slight dramatization of historic victories by severely outnumbered English frigates off Surat in 1612 and 1614, commanded by English captains Thomas Best and Nicholas Downton, both ailing for the early East India Company. Hawksworth's mercurial relationship with the Moghul and his experiences at the Moghul's court were recreated in part from the letters and diaries of William Hawkins and those of his successor, Sir Thomas Roe. As did Brian Hawksworth, William Hawkins adopted the Indian style of life in dress and diet, much to the astonishment of his European contemporaries. Brian Hawksworth's love affair with Shirin was suggested by William Hawkins' marriage to an Indian woman of noble descent, possibly a member of the Moghul's court, on the encouragement of Jahangir, who suspected the Jesuits of attempting to poison him and wanted his food monitored. Hawkins' wife later journeyed to London, where she caused the East India Company considerable disruption over their responsibilities toward her, and eventually she returned to India. Although most of the early Englishmen in India resembled our George Elkington, far more than they did Brian Hawksworth, there was one early traveler, Thomas Coriat, whose cultural and human sensibilities would not have clashed greatly with those of Brian Hawksworth at the end of his story. The sudden appearance of the bubonic plague in India was taken from the court history of the Moghul Jahangir. Similarly, the capture of the Moghul's trading vessel by the Portuguese intended to intimidate him and forestall an English trade agreement, and his retaliatory closure of Jesuit missions happened essentially as described. The Jesuits were allowed to reopen their missions a few years later, but the damage was done. There seems evidence that the Portuguese did conspire to assist the force, opposing the succession of Shah Jahan, whom they justifiably feared. The rebellion of Shah Jahan extended over several years, and did include at one point a stay on the Udaipur island of Jagmandir, where some historians now believe he first saw inlay work of the type that later became a distinguishing feature of his crowning creation, the Taj Mahal. For those who may wish to gain more familiarity with Moghul India, various sources can be recommended. Historical works on the Moghul period include Waldemar Hansen's classic panorama, The Peacock Throne, and the even more recent Cities of Mughal India by Gavin Hambley, to mention two of my favorites. For those still more curious and adventurous, there are the original writings from the 17th century, which will require more digging but are decidedly worth the effort. Readers with access to a major library may be able to find reprinted editions of the diaries of several 17th century English and European travelers in India. These are the works, with their trenchant first-hand accounts, that all students of the era find indispensable. Perhaps the most easily obtainable is a collection titled Early Travels in India, William Foster, ed., which contains edited versions of the diaries of William Hawkins and several others. Following this, the most thorough account of England's early diplomacy in India is contained in the Dyer. He entitled The Embassy of Sir Thomas Roe, 1615 to 1619, written by England's first real ambassador to India. Many subsequent diaries and letters of 17th-century European travelers have been reprinted by the Hacklight Society, whose publications comprise a virtual bibliography of the era. The most relevant Indian writings, also obtainable in English translation from a fine library, are the memoirs of the great Moghul Jahangir, entitled the Tuzak-i Jahangiri, and an encyclopedic description of court life in late 16th century India, entitled the Ain-i Akbari, set down by Akbar's chief advisor and close friend, Abul Fazl. In fashioning a story such as this, a writer must necessarily be indebted far beyond his ability to acknowledge adequately. The scholar who provided the greatest assistance was Professor John Richards of the Duke University Department of History, a widely respected authority on Moghul. He might prefer it be spelled Moghul, India, who graciously consented to review the manuscript in draft and offered many corrections of fact and interpretation. He is, of course, in no way accountable for any liberties that may have remained. Thanks are similarly due Professor Gerald Berriman of the University of California at Berkeley, a knowledgeable authority on Indian caste practices, who agreed to review the relevant portions of the manuscript. I am also indebted to Waldemar Hansen, who generously provided me with the voluminous notes accumulated for his own history, The Peacock Throne, historians in India who gave warmly of their time and advice include Dr. Ramila Thapar, Professor P.M. Joshi, and Father John Correa Alfonso, the preeminent Jesuit authority on the early Moghul era, and a scholar whose characteristic integrity and generosity roundly revive the period depiction of his order in the story. Thanks also are due Mrs. De Villa Mitra, Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, for special permission to study the now restricted Zenana quarters beneath the Red Fort in Agra, to Nawab Mir Sultan Alam Khan of Surat for assistance in locating obscure historical sites in that city, to Indrani Rehman, the Grand Dame of Indian classical dance, for information on the now-abolished Devadasi caste, to Ustad Vilayat Khan, one of India's great sitar masters, for discussions concerning his art, and to my many Indian friends in New York, New Delhi, and Bombay. I am also obliged to Miss Betty Tyers of the Indian Department of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, who kindly provided access to the museum's extensive archives of Indian miniature paintings, and to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich for information on early English sailing vessels. Finally, I am most indebted to a number of tireless readers who reviewed the manuscript in its various drafts and supplied many insightful suggestions, including my editor, Lisa Drew, my agent, Virginia Barber, and my patient friends Joyce Hawley, Susan Feinstein, Norman Feinstein, Ronald Miller, and Gary Prydox. Most of all, I thank Julie Hoover for many years of assistance, encouragement, and enthusiasm.